Picture this: a 13th century peasant woman named Agnes stands at the edge of her barley field in Gloucestershire, watching smoke rise from the distant hills. But this isn't the familiar smoke of a neighbour's hearth, or even the dreaded black plumes of raiders burning villages. This smoke moves. It spirals upward in deliberate patterns, and beneath it, something massive casts a shadow that slides across the landscape like a storm cloud with purpose. Agnes crosses herself and whispers a prayer, because she knows what lives in those hills. Everyone in her village knows. Everyone in medieval Europe knows, just as surely as they know wolves prowl the forests and bears lumber through mountain passes. Dragons are real, and they're hungry. Now, before you dismiss this as another fantasy tale spun from the threads of legend, consider something remarkable. Medieval people didn't think of dragons as mythical creatures. They catalogued them in their bestiaries, alongside lions, elephants, and crocodiles. They wrote about them with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to describe any other dangerous animal. They believed in dragons not because they were gullible, but because enough people had seen them, or knew someone who had seen them, or had witnessed the aftermath of their presence. The evidence was everywhere: scorched earth where no wildfire had burned, livestock vanishing overnight, and those distinctive claw marks gouged deep into stone. But what if medieval people were right? What if dragons weren't the stuff of legend, but flesh and blood creatures that shared the world with knights and peasants, monks and merchants? What if we could peel back the layers of myth and examine dragons not as magical beasts, but as biological organisms that evolved alongside humans, shaped by the same forces of natural selection that produced every other creature on Earth? Tonight, we're going to explore that possibility. We're going to reconstruct what dragons might have actually been like as living, breathing animals. We'll examine their anatomy, their behaviour, their ecological niche, and most importantly, how their existence would have fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. Because if dragons had been real, everything we know about the Middle Ages would be different. The rise and fall of kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, the development of technology, the patterns of trade and warfare, even the way people thought about their place in the natural world, all of it would have been shaped by the presence of these apex predators soaring through medieval skies. So let's begin with the creature itself. What would a real dragon actually look like? Forget the rainbow-scaled behemoths of modern fantasy. A real dragon would be governed by the same biological constraints as every other flying animal that has ever lived. And those constraints tell us a lot about what dragons could and couldn't be. First, size. The largest flying birds that ever existed, like the extinct Argentavis, had wingspans of around 25 feet and weighed perhaps 150 pounds. But dragons, if they existed, would need to be significantly larger to pose the kind of threat that medieval sources describe. They'd need to be big enough to carry off cattle, to break through wooden palisades, to serve as the living siege engines that appear in some accounts. Yet they'd also need to remain light enough to achieve powered flight. The solution lies in understanding that dragon bones would have been hollow, like those of birds, but with a more complex internal structure. Think of it as biological engineering at its finest. A dragon's skeleton would be a masterpiece of weight reduction, with bones that were simultaneously lighter than solid mammalian bones, but stronger than simple hollow bird bones. Their bones would feature intricate internal bracing similar to the struts inside an airplane wing, providing maximum strength with minimum weight. A mature dragon might have measured 30 to 40 feet from the nose to tail, with a wingspan approaching 80 feet, but despite their impressive size, they would have weighed only 800 to 1,200 pounds, about the same as a large horse. Their wings would have been leathery membranes stretched between elongated finger bones, similar to a bat's wing, but scaled up dramatically. The wing membrane itself would have been incredibly thin, but reinforced with a network of elastic fibers that could stretch and contract with each wing beat. Flight muscles would have dominated their anatomy. A dragon's breast would have been a massive keel of muscle, similar to, but much larger than that of a bird. These muscles would have attached to an enlarged breastbone that projected forward like the prow of a ship. When you see medieval depictions of dragons with prominent chests, they weren't being artistic, they were being anatomically accurate. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of dragon biology would have been their ability to breathe fire. This wasn't magic, it was chemistry. And we know it's possible because similar mechanisms exist in nature today. The bombardier beetle can spray a boiling hot chemical mixture at its enemies by combining hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone in specialized chambers in its abdomen. Scale that up, add some refinements, and you have a plausible fire-breathing mechanism. Dragons would have possessed paired chemical glands in their throats, similar to venom glands in snakes, but much larger. One gland would have produced a fuel compound, likely a mixture of methane and hydrogen, generated by specialized bacteria in the dragon's digestive system. The other would have produced an oxidizer, probably hydrogen peroxide concentrated to dangerous levels. When these chemicals mixed in the dragon's throat and were expelled forcefully through muscular contractions, they would have ignited spontaneously, creating a jet of flame that could reach temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The dragon's throat and mouth would have been lined with heat-resistant tissues, similar to the throat of a pelican but adapted for extreme temperatures. Their teeth would have been ceramic-like structures, able to withstand the intense heat of their own breath weapon. And their tongues would have been long, serpentine organs that could flick out to taste the air, detecting chemical signatures of prey or predators from miles away. This fire-breathing ability would have served multiple purposes. Obviously, it was a weapon, capable of killing large prey or defending against threats. But it would also have been a tool for hunting. Dragons could have used controlled bursts of flame to drive prey into ambush positions, or to flush animals out of dense cover. They might have even used fire to cook their food, making tough hides and bones more digestible. Now, where would such creatures have lived? Dragons would have been creatures of the margins, inhabiting the wild places that humans couldn't easily reach or control. Mountain caves would have been ideal nesting sites, providing protection from weather and enemies, while offering commanding views of the surrounding territory. Volcanic regions would have been particularly attractive, not because dragons needed magical energy, but because the warm thermal vents would have helped them regulate their body temperature, and the sulfurous environment would have provided raw materials for their chemical breath weapon. But dragons wouldn't have been confined to remote mountain peaks. They would have needed access to water, both for drinking and for the chemical processes that powered their fire breathing. Coastal areas with sea caves would have been prime dragon habitat, as would river valleys with limestone caverns. The key would have been finding locations that offered both security and access to hunting grounds. And what would they have hunted? Dragons would have been opportunistic predators with a preference for large prey. Cattle and horses would have been ideal targets, large enough to provide substantial meals, but not so large as to be unmanageable. Sheep and goats would have been easier prey, but would have required dragons to hunt more frequently. Wild animals like deer, elk, and boar would have formed the bulk of their diet in areas away from human settlement. But dragons would also have been intelligent enough to recognize patterns in human behavior. They would have learned that attacking isolated farms was safer than raiding heavily defended settlements. They would have developed hunting strategies that minimized their exposure to human weapons while maximizing their access to livestock. Some dragons might have even established regular hunting circuits, visiting the same areas on predictable schedules, which would explain why some medieval accounts describe dragon attacks as seasonal events. The reproductive cycle of dragons would have been slow and deliberate, more like that of large reptiles than birds. Female dragons would have laid clutches of 2 to 4 eggs, perhaps once every 3 to 5 years. These eggs would have been enormous, the size of watermelons, with shells thick enough to protect the developing dragon through a lengthy incubation period of 12 to 18 months. Dragon eggs would have been incredibly valuable, both to the dragons themselves and to humans who might have discovered them. The shells would have been prized for their strength and beauty, while the contents would have been sought after for their supposed medicinal properties. Medieval alchemists would have paid fortunes for dragon eggs, believing them to contain the essence of fire itself. Young dragons would have been vulnerable for several years after hatching, unable to fly effectively or produce flame until they reached adolescence. This would have meant that adult dragons were fiercely protective of their nesting sites and would have responded to any threat to their young with devastating fury. It also means that dragon populations would have been inherently unstable, with small changes in survival rates having dramatic effects on the overall population. The intelligence of dragons would have been considerable, comparable to that of the great apes or perhaps dolphins. They would have been capable of learning, remembering, and even planning. This intelligence would have made them far more dangerous than simple predators, because they could adapt their behavior based on human responses. If humans developed new defensive strategies, dragons would have countered with new attack methods. This brings us to one of the most important questions. How would medieval people have first encountered dragons? The answer lies in understanding that dragons and humans would have been sharing the European landscape for thousands of years before the medieval period began. Early hunter-gatherer societies would have developed complex relationships with dragons, probably involving a mixture of avoidance, appeasement, and occasional conflict. Archaeological evidence of dragon-human interaction would have been subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Burn patterns on prehistoric settlements that were too controlled to be accidental fires. Claw marks on cave walls that were too large and too high to have been made by any known animal. And most tellingly, the complete absence of certain types of settlements in areas that would otherwise have been ideal for human habitation. By the time the Roman Empire was collapsing and the medieval period was beginning, European societies would have already developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with dragons. These wouldn't have been the dramatic confrontations of legend, but practical everyday adaptations to living in a world where apex predators could attack from above. Villages would have been built with dragon attacks in mind. Houses would have featured reinforced roofs and narrow windows that couldn't admit a dragon's claws. Livestock would have been kept in stone shelters rather than wooden pens. Church bells would have served not just to call people to prayer, but as dragon warning systems, with specific bell patterns indicating the direction and distance of approaching threats. The feudal system itself would have been shaped by the presence of dragons. Lords who could offer effective protection against dragon attacks would have attracted more peasants to their lands. Castles would have been designed not just to withstand human armies, but to provide refuge for entire communities when dragons attacked. The evolution of medieval armor would have been influenced by the need to protect against dragonfire as well as human weapons. But perhaps most importantly, dragons would have fundamentally altered medieval Christianity. The church would have been forced to develop theological explanations for these creatures that breathed fire and seemed to embody the very essence of destruction. Some theologians might have seen dragons as demons made manifest, proof of Satan's power in the physical world. Others might have argued that dragons were part of God's creation, serving some divine purpose that humans were not meant to understand. The lives of the saints would have been filled with dragon encounters, not the symbolic dragons of later legend, but real, dangerous animals that had to be dealt with through faith, courage, and sometimes simple practical knowledge of dragon behavior. St. George wouldn't have been a mythical figure, but a historical person who developed effective techniques for hunting dragons and shared that knowledge with other Christian warriors. The economic impact of dragons would have been enormous. Entire industries would have developed around dragon proofing and dragon hunting. Specialized craftsmen would have created dragon-resistant building materials, dragon-detecting instruments, and dragon-fighting weapons. Trade routes would have been planned to avoid known dragon territories, adding weeks or months to journeys, but ensuring that merchant caravans arrived intact. But dragons would also have provided opportunities for those brave or desperate enough to exploit them. Dragon scales would have been incredibly valuable for armor. Dragon blood might have had genuine medicinal properties, or at least would have been believed to have them. Dragon teeth and claws would have been prized for weapons and tools. A single dragon carcass would have represented wealth beyond the dreams of most medieval people. As we stand here at the beginning of our journey into this alternate history, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about adding monsters to the medieval world. We're talking about fundamentally reimagining how human civilization developed when it had to contend with intelligent, flying, fire-breathing predators. Every aspect of medieval life, from the most mundane daily routines to the grandest political machinations, would have been shaped by the reality of dragons. The peasant woman Agnes, standing in her barley field and watching that ominous smoke in the distance, represents millions of people who would have lived their entire lives in the shadow of these creatures. Their fears, their hopes, their innovations, and their adaptations would have created a world both familiar and utterly alien to the medieval period we think we know. But this is just the beginning. We've established what dragons might have been like as biological organisms, and touched on how their presence would have affected the basic structures of medieval society. Now we need to dive deeper, to explore how these creatures would have shaped the great events and movements that define the Middle Ages. We need to examine how dragons would have influenced the rise of feudalism, the spread of Christianity, the development of military technology, and the complex web of political relationships that characterized medieval Europe. The smoke in the distance is getting closer, and Agnes is about to discover just how much her world is about to change. The first recorded dragon attack on a major military force occurred in the spring of 1066, just months before the Norman conquest. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Harold Godwinson's army was marching north to confront the Norwegian invasion, when scouts reported a massive creature circling above the enemy camp near Stamford Bridge. What followed was not the stuff of legend, but a brutal demonstration of how dragons had been quietly shaping European warfare for centuries. The Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, had done something unprecedented. Instead of simply enduring dragon attacks like most medieval rulers, he had attempted to weaponize them. His forces had been carrying massive iron cages filled with rotting whale meat, deliberately attracting dragons to follow his army south. The plan was simple and ruthless. When the two armies met, release the bait and let the dragons do what dragons did best: destroy everything. But dragons weren't siege engines that could be aimed and fired. They were intelligent predators with their own agendas. The creature that had been following Hardrada's army took one look at the assembled English forces and made a calculated decision. Why fight for scraps of whale meat when fresh horses and men were available? It swept down on both armies indiscriminately, breathing superheated gas that turned mail into molten metal and reduced wooden shields to ash in seconds. The battle that ensued was unlike anything recorded in medieval warfare. Both armies found themselves fighting not just each other, but a common enemy that attacked from above. English and Norwegian soldiers who'd been preparing to kill each other moments before were suddenly diving into the same ditches, seeking shelter from claws that could punch through chainmail like paper. The dragon, meanwhile, was learning. Each pass taught it something new about human defensive formations, about the range of arrows and spears, about the best angles of attack. What the chroniclers didn't understand, but what we can reconstruct from their confused accounts, is that this dragon was employing hunting strategies that had been refined over centuries of predation on human settlements. It would attack in short, devastating bursts, then retreat to a safe distance, while its prey exhausted themselves with futile counterattacks. It targeted horses first, knowing that mobility was crucial to human military effectiveness. It used its flame, not as a continuous breath weapon, but in precise economical jets, designed to create maximum chaos with minimum energy expenditure. The battle ended not with victory for either side, but with mutual withdrawal. Both armies had lost too many men and horses to continue fighting each other. Harold Hardrada himself had been killed, not by an English arrow as history records, but by dragon fire while trying to rally his scattered forces. The creature eventually departed, its appetite satisfied and its territorial boundaries clearly established. The surviving warriors on both sides had learned a lesson that would reshape European military thinking for the next 4 centuries. Dragons were not forces of nature to be endured, but active participants in human conflicts that had to be planned for, prepared against, and when possible, exploited. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, dragons had been quietly influencing the outcome of major battles across Europe. At Hastings, just weeks after Stamford Bridge, William the Conqueror's victory was aided by the fact that his Norman cavalry had been trained specifically for dragon encounters. Norman horses were selected not just for speed and strength, but for their ability to remain calm under the stress of aerial attack. Norman knights carried specialized shields with reinforced edges designed to deflect dragon claws, and their battle formations included designated dragon watchers, whose only job was to scan the skies and sound warnings. The English, by contrast, were still fighting as if dragons were random natural disasters rather than tactical considerations. Their shield walls, so effective against human cavalry charges, were death traps when attacked from above. Their long-handled axes, perfect for dismounting Norman knights, were useless against targets flying 50 feet overhead. When a dragon appeared over the battlefield at Hastings, probably drawn by the scent of blood and the sound of combat, the English formation collapsed within minutes. Norman chroniclers later claimed that the dragon had been sent by God to ensure William's righteous victory, but the reality was more prosaic. The Normans had simply adapted their military doctrine to account for dragons, while the English had not. This adaptation hadn't happened overnight. Norman military culture had been shaped by 2 centuries of dragon encounters in their original Scandinavian homelands. Viking raiders had been among the first Europeans to develop systematic approaches to dragon hunting, not out of heroic impulse, but out of pure economic necessity. Dragons competed with Vikings for the same resources, coastal settlements rich in livestock and portable wealth. A dragon that had claimed a particular fjord or island could make Viking raids impossible, turning profitable targets into death traps. The solution had been characteristically Viking. If you couldn't avoid dragons, you hunted them. But dragon hunting required more than individual courage. It demanded coordinated group tactics, specialized equipment, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of dragon behavior and biology. Vikings had been the first Europeans to study dragons scientifically, observing their flight patterns, mapping their territorial ranges, and documenting their seasonal behaviors. They discovered that dragons were creatures of habit. A dragon that hunted cattle in a particular valley would return to that valley at predictable intervals, usually following the same flight path and landing in the same locations. Dragons mark their territories with scent glands located near their tails, leaving chemical signatures that other dragons could detect from miles away. They preferred to hunt during specific weather conditions, avoiding high winds that made flight difficult and storms that interfered with their ability to produce flame. Most importantly, Vikings learned that dragons were vulnerable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Their fire-breathing capability required a complex internal chemistry that could be disrupted. A dragon that had just used its flame weapon extensively would need time to regenerate the chemical components, during which it could only rely on physical attacks. Dragons that were egg-heavy or caring for young would be more aggressive but less mobile, easier to predict but more dangerous to approach. This knowledge had been accumulated through generations of trial and error, paid for with the lives of countless warriors who had tried and failed to bring down dragons through brute force alone. By the time the Normans conquered England, they possessed what amounted to a comprehensive dragon fighting manual, passed down through oral tradition and preserved in the collective memory of their military elite. The English, meanwhile, had developed a completely different relationship with dragons. Rather than hunting them, Anglo-Saxon culture had emphasized avoidance and appeasement. English settlements were built in locations that dragons typically ignored. River valleys rather than coastal areas, dense forests rather than open plains, areas with poor visibility from above rather than prominent hilltops. English churches included architectural features designed specifically for dragon encounters, reinforced roofs that could withstand claw strikes, multiple exits that allowed congregations to scatter quickly, and bell towers that served as early warning systems. This defensive mindset had served the English well during peacetime, but it left them completely unprepared for dragons being used as weapons of war. When Norman tactics began incorporating dragon encounters as routine battlefield considerations, English military leaders found themselves fighting an enemy that understood dimensions of warfare they had never seriously considered. The transformation of European military thinking in the wake of the Norman conquest was dramatic and comprehensive. Within a generation, every major military power had established dragon response protocols. Castle design evolved to include features that had nothing to do with human attackers. Courtyards covered with stone rather than wood to prevent fire damage. Walls with overhanging battlements that made it difficult for dragons to land, and underground chambers where defenders could retreat during aerial attacks. The development of specialized anti-dragon weapons became a major industry. Crossbows were redesigned with greater range and power, capable of penetrating dragon hide at distances that kept archers relatively safe from retaliation. New types of armor appeared, featuring overlapping scales that mimicked dragon hide and provided better protection against both claws and flame. Shields were reinforced with metal bands arranged in patterns that had been observed to deflect dragon attacks most effectively. But perhaps the most significant change was in military recruitment and training. By the early 12th century, every major European army included specialists whose primary job was dragon management. These weren't the romantic dragon slayers of later legend, but practical soldiers who understood dragon behavior the way cavalry officers understood horses, or siege engineers understood fortifications. Dragon specialists were typically recruited from rural areas where dragon encounters were more common. They needed to possess not just physical courage, but the kind of patient observational skills that allowed them to predict dragon behavior based on subtle environmental cues. A good dragon specialist could tell from the way smoke moved in the distance whether it was produced by dragon fire or ordinary combustion. They could read weather patterns to predict when dragons would be most likely to hunt, and terrain features to guess where dragons might establish temporary roosts. These specialists formed the core of what became known as dragon cavalry units, military formations that were designed specifically to operate in areas where dragon encounters were likely. Dragon cavalry didn't ride horses, which were too vulnerable to aerial attack, but fought on foot using tactics that emphasized mobility, dispersal, and coordinated counterattacks. They carried lightweight equipment that wouldn't slow them down during rapid retreats, and their armor prioritized protection against fire and claws over the crushing blows of human weapons. The psychological impact of dragon cavalry on traditional military formations was enormous. Infantry squares and cavalry charges, the dominant tactical formations of early medieval warfare, became obsolete almost overnight. Armies that continued to use massed formations found themselves helpless against enemies who could call dragon strikes down on concentrated troops. Military leaders were forced to develop new doctrines based on small unit tactics, dispersed formations, and rapid movement. This military revolution had profound political consequences. The feudal system, which was based on the military dominance of heavily armored cavalry, began to break down as mounted knights became increasingly vulnerable to dragon attacks. Lords who could afford to maintain dragon cavalry units found themselves with significant advantages over those who relied on traditional military forces. Political power began to shift toward rulers who controlled territories where dragons could be hunted or, in rare cases, somehow enlisted as allies. the Church was forced to develop its own theological response to the militarization of dragons. Early Christian doctrine had portrayed dragons as symbols of evil, creatures associated with Satan and the forces of darkness. But when Christian armies began using dragon specialists and dragon cavalry, Church scholars found themselves in the awkward position of having to justify the use of allegedly demonic creatures in righteous warfare. The solution was characteristically medieval in its complexity. Dragons, Church theologians argued, were not inherently evil, but were part of God's creation that had been corrupted by the fall. Like all of nature, dragons could be redeemed through proper Christian use. A dragon that destroyed a pagan temple was performing God's work. A dragon that defended Christian territory against Muslim invaders was acting as an instrument of divine will. The key was not the nature of the dragon itself, but the spiritual state of the humans who encountered it. This theological framework allowed Christian rulers to incorporate dragon warfare into their military arsenals without compromising their religious legitimacy. It also provided justification for the massive resources that were being devoted to dragon-related military expenses. Training dragon specialists, maintaining dragon cavalry units, and building dragon-resistant fortifications were enormously expensive, but they could be justified as necessary expenses for defending Christendom against its enemies. The Crusades, which began at the end of the 11th century, were profoundly shaped by these developments in dragon warfare. When Pope Urban II called for Christian armies to march on Jerusalem, military leaders from across Europe brought with them not just traditional weapons and tactics, but hard-won expertise in fighting alongside and against dragons. The First Crusade encountered dragons almost immediately upon entering Anatolia. The arid mountainous terrain of eastern Turkey was ideal dragon habitat, and the local Byzantine and Muslim populations had developed their own methods for dealing with dragon encounters that were completely different from European approaches. Rather than hunting dragons or avoiding them, Middle Eastern cultures had developed systems of tribute and negotiation. Local rulers would designate specific areas as dragon territories and provide regular offerings of livestock to keep dragons fed and content. In exchange, dragons would generally avoid human settlements and sometimes even provide protection against rival human armies. This system required a much more sophisticated understanding of dragon psychology and social behavior than anything Europeans had developed, but it also created opportunities for dragons to be used as active military assets, rather than just environmental hazards to be managed. The clash between European dragon hunting culture and Middle Eastern dragon tribute systems created some of the most complex military situations in medieval history. European crusaders would arrive in a region and immediately begin hunting local dragons, not understanding that these creatures were part of established political and economic relationships. Local rulers who had spent decades carefully managing their relationships with dragon populations would find their entire diplomatic framework destroyed by foreign warriors who saw dragons only as targets to be eliminated. The siege of Antioch in 1098 became a perfect example of how dragon conflicts could reshape the entire strategic situation of a military campaign. The city was defended not just by its Muslim garrison, but by a pair of dragons that had been nesting in the nearby mountains for over a century. These dragons had been receiving tribute from the city's rulers for generations and had come to view Antioch as part of their protected territory. When the Crusader army arrived and began their siege, they made the mistake of setting up their camp in an area that the dragons considered their hunting ground. The first dragon attack came at dawn on the third day of the siege, and it was unlike anything the European knights had experienced. These weren't the relatively small, solitary dragons of Northern Europe, but massive creatures that hunted in coordinated pairs and had been feeding on tribute for so long that they showed no fear of human weapons or formations. The attack devastated the Crusader camp. Horses were killed by the dozens, supply wagons were incinerated, and entire units of infantry were scattered by creatures that seemed to move with intelligence and purpose rather than animal instinct. But more importantly, from a strategic perspective, the dragon attack forced the Crusaders to completely rethink their approach to the siege. Traditional siege warfare involved surrounding a city and gradually wearing down its defences through a combination of direct assault and blockade. But dragons made it impossible to maintain the kind of concentrated stationary positions that traditional sieges required. The Crusader army was forced to adopt a much more mobile approach, constantly moving their camps and supply lines to avoid dragon attacks while still maintaining pressure on the city's defences. This led to the development of what military historians would later call dragon siege tactics, a completely new form of warfare that combined elements of traditional siegecraft with the mobility and dispersal techniques that had been developed for dragon encounters. Instead of building massive siege engines that could be destroyed by dragonfire, Crusader engineers developed smaller, more portable devices that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as the tactical situation changed. The siege of Antioch lasted for 8 months, far longer than it would have taken to reduce a traditional medieval fortification. But the final victory was achieved through a combination of traditional military assault and dragon diplomacy that would have been unthinkable in European warfare. A group of Armenian Christians who lived in the mountains near Antioch had maintained relationships with the local dragon population for generations. They were able to negotiate a temporary truce that allowed the Crusader assault to proceed without dragon interference, in exchange for guarantees that the dragon's traditional tribute arrangements would be respected under Christian rule. The fall of Antioch sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, not just because a major city had been captured by Christian invaders, but because those invaders had demonstrated an ability to negotiate with dragons in ways that challenged traditional Middle Eastern approaches to dragon management. If European armies could adapt their tactics to incorporate both dragon hunting and dragon diplomacy, they would be far more dangerous opponents than anyone had anticipated. The response was swift and comprehensive. Muslim military leaders across the region began incorporating European-style dragon specialists into their own armies, while simultaneously working to strengthen their traditional tribute relationships with local dragon populations. The result was an arms race in dragon warfare that would dominate Middle Eastern military thinking for the next 2 centuries. By the time the Second Crusade began in 1147, both Christian and Muslim armies had developed sophisticated doctrines for dragon warfare that bore little resemblance to the improvised tactics of the First Crusade. Battles were fought not just between human armies, but between competing systems of dragon alliance and dragon management. The outcome of major engagements often depended as much on which side could secure dragon cooperation as on traditional factors like numbers, equipment, and terrain. This militarization of dragons had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefields of the Holy Land. European armies returning from the Crusades brought with them not just new weapons and tactics, but fundamentally new ways of thinking about the relationship between humans and dragons. The idea that dragons could be negotiated with, that they had their own political and economic interests, that they could be allies as well as enemies, revolutionized European approaches to dragon encounters. The age of pure dragon hunting was coming to an end, replaced by a much more complex and nuanced understanding of dragons as intelligent creatures with their own motivations and goals. This shift would have profound implications for European society, economics, and politics as the High Middle Ages progressed into the later medieval period. The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills was getting closer now, and with it came changes that would transform not just her village, but the entire structure of medieval civilization. By the 13th century, the relationship between humans and dragons had evolved into something far more complex than the simple predator-prey dynamic that had characterized earlier periods. What emerged was a sophisticated web of economic, political, and social arrangements that would have seemed impossible to the Viking dragon hunters of 3 centuries before. Dragons weren't just being managed or avoided anymore. They were becoming integrated into the very fabric of medieval civilization. The transformation began in the trading cities of northern Italy, where merchant princes had always been more interested in profit than in traditional notions of chivalric glory. Venice, with its extensive network of Mediterranean trade routes, was among the first to recognize that dragons represented not just a threat to be neutralized, but a resource to be exploited. The key insight came from observing how dragons interacted with their environment in ways that could benefit human commerce. Dragons, it turned out, were extraordinarily effective at clearing shipping lanes of pirates. A single dragon patrolling the waters between Venice and Constantinople could make an entire trade route safe for merchant vessels. Pirates operating small, fast galleys had no defense against aerial attack, and news of dragon presence spread quickly through the maritime underworld. Within months of a dragon establishing hunting grounds along a particular shipping lane, piracy in that area would virtually disappear. The Venetians were quick to capitalize on this discovery. Rather than driving dragons away from their trade routes, they began actively attracting them. Merchant ships started carrying specific types of bait, fish oils and meat scraps that dragons found irresistible. They established feeding stations on small islands along major shipping lanes, creating what amounted to dragon service stops that encouraged the creatures to patrol these areas regularly. This wasn't simple bribery. The Venetians had studied dragon behavior closely enough to understand that these creatures were territorial and hierarchical. A dragon that had claimed a particular stretch of water would actively defend it against other dragons, creating stable, predictable zones of dragon protection. By carefully managing the feeding stations and monitoring dragon movements, Venetian merchants could ensure that their most valuable trade routes remained under dragon protection while directing the creatures away from ports and coastal settlements. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Shipping insurance rates for Venice-protected routes dropped by more than half. Delivery times became more predictable, since merchants no longer had to factor in delays caused by pirate attacks or the need to travel in large, slow-moving convoys for protection. The speed and efficiency of Venetian trade increased so dramatically that other maritime powers were forced to develop their own dragon management strategies or risk being driven out of business. Genoa responded by establishing the first formal dragon rider corps in European history. Rather than simply attracting wild dragons to their trade routes, the Genoese attempted to train dragons for specific commercial purposes. This was an enormously risky undertaking that cost the lives of dozens of volunteers before the first successful dragon-human partnerships were established. The key breakthrough came from studying how dragons raise their young. Baby dragons, researchers discovered, imprinted on the first large moving objects they encountered after hatching, much like ducklings imprinting on their mothers. Genoese dragon trainers began stealing dragon eggs and raising the hatchlings in carefully controlled environments where human handlers were the primary caretakers. This process required incredible patience and resources. Dragon eggs had to be kept at precise temperatures for over a year before hatching. The hatchlings needed constant care and feeding for several more years before they were large enough to be useful. During this vulnerable period, they were susceptible to diseases, accidents, and the occasional attack by wild adult dragons who viewed the human-raised youngsters as territorial threats. But the dragons that survived this process formed bonds with their human handlers that were unlike anything seen in nature. These weren't the wary, mutually beneficial relationships that characterize most human-dragon interactions, but genuine partnerships based on emotional attachment and shared experience. Human-bonded dragons would respond to verbal commands, tolerate being touched and handled, and even allow riders to direct their flight patterns. The first successful dragon-assisted merchant voyage departed Genoa in 1198, bound for Alexandria with a cargo of Flemish wool and English tin. The dragon, a relatively small female named Stella by her handler, flew reconnaissance patterns around the merchant convoy, reporting back on weather conditions, potential threats, and navigation hazards. When Barbary corsairs attempted to intercept the convoy near the coast of North Africa, Stella's attack scattered the pirate fleet before they could close with the merchant ships. The voyage was completed in record time with 0 losses, and news of the success spread rapidly through European commercial circles. Within a decade, every major trading power was attempting to establish its own Dragon Rider programs. The results were mixed, with most efforts ending in failure, injury, or death. Dragons were not horses to be easily tamed, and the process of forming human-dragon bonds remained dangerous and unpredictable. But the potential rewards were so enormous that investment in dragon training continued despite the risks. A single trained dragon could provide services that would otherwise require dozens of ships and hundreds of men. Dragon riders could scout ahead of merchant convoys, providing early warning of storms, pirates, or hostile fleets. They could carry urgent messages between distant cities faster than any horse or ship. In emergency situations, they could evacuate valuable cargo or personnel from threatened locations. The social implications of dragon riding were as significant as the economic ones. Dragon riders occupied a unique position in medieval society, neither noble nor common, neither clergy nor secular. They were essential to the operation of long-distance trade, but they were also viewed with a mixture of awe and suspicion by traditional social groups. The church struggled to determine whether dragon riding was a legitimate profession or a form of devil worship. The nobility worried that dragon riders represented a new form of military power that could challenge traditional feudal hierarchies. These concerns were not unfounded. A skilled dragon rider with a well-trained mount was more militarily effective than a dozen knights. Dragons could attack from angles that ground-based forces couldn't defend against, move faster than cavalry, and strike with force that could shatter traditional defensive formations. The implications for medieval warfare were staggering, and it didn't take long for military leaders to recognize the potential. The first military use of trained dragons occurred during the Fourth Crusade, though not in the way that church leaders had intended. When the Crusader army found itself unable to pay the Venetians for transport to the Holy Land, Doge Enrico Dandolo demanded military service in exchange for passage. The target was Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital that controlled the entrance to the Black Sea. The siege of Constantinople in 1204 became the first major medieval battle to feature coordinated dragon rider attacks. The Venetians had brought 3 trained dragons with their handlers, ostensibly for reconnaissance and communication purposes. But when the assault on the city began, the dragons were used as flying siege engines, dropping incendiary materials onto the city's wooden buildings and attacking defenders on the walls where they were most vulnerable. The psychological impact of the dragon attacks was as important as their physical effectiveness. Byzantine defenders had never faced aerial assault before, and their defensive preparations were completely inadequate for dealing with attacks from above. The great chain that protected Constantinople's harbour, an engineering marvel that had kept enemy fleets at bay for centuries, was useless against dragons that could simply fly over it. But perhaps more significantly, the use of dragons in the siege marked a fundamental shift in how medieval people thought about these creatures. Dragons were no longer forces of nature to be endured or wild animals to be hunted. They had become weapons of war, tools that could be used to project human power across vast distances. The age of dragon warfare had truly begun. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through both the Christian and Islamic worlds. If dragons could be used to capture the greatest fortress city in the eastern Mediterranean, no defensive position was truly secure. Military architects across Europe and the Middle East began redesigning fortifications to account for aerial attack. Castle walls were extended upward and outward to make it difficult for dragons to land on battlements. Roofs were reinforced with stone and metal to resist fire attacks. Underground tunnels and chambers were expanded to provide refuge during dragon assaults. But defensive measures were only part of the response. Every major power began attempting to develop their own dragon forces, leading to what historians would later call the Great Dragon Race of the 13th century. The competition was fierce and often deadly, as different kingdoms and city-states competed for access to dragon eggs, experienced trainers, and suitable nesting sites. The Holy Roman Empire established a massive dragon training facility in the mountains of Bavaria, where captured dragon eggs were incubated under carefully controlled conditions. The French crown invested enormous sums in expeditions to remote mountain regions, where wild dragons were known to nest, hoping to establish breeding programs that could produce dragons loyal to the French monarchy. Even England, separated from the continent by the English Channel, began developing naval strategies that incorporated dragon reconnaissance and attack capabilities. The Church found itself in an increasingly difficult position as dragons became militarized. Traditional Christian theology had portrayed dragons as symbols of evil, creatures associated with Satan and the forces of darkness. But when Christian armies began using dragons as weapons against Muslim enemies, Church doctrine had to be modified to accommodate this new reality. The solution, developed by scholars at the University of Paris, was characteristically medieval in its complexity. Dragons, they argued, were neutral creatures that took on the moral characteristics of their human handlers. A dragon guided by a righteous Christian warrior became an instrument of God's will. A dragon controlled by pagans or heretics remained a tool of evil. The key was not the nature of the dragon itself, but the spiritual state of the human who directed its actions. This theological framework allowed Christian rulers to incorporate dragons into their military forces without compromising their religious legitimacy. It also provided justification for the enormous resources being devoted to dragon training and maintenance. Keeping a war dragon was extraordinarily expensive, requiring specialized handlers, custom-built facilities, and enormous quantities of food. A single adult dragon could consume the equivalent of 50 cattle per month, not counting the additional livestock needed to maintain peak fighting condition. But the costs were justified by the strategic advantages that dragons provided. A kingdom with effective dragon forces could project power far beyond its traditional borders. Dragon riders could strike at enemy supply lines, reconnaissance enemy troop movements, and provide rapid communication between distant military commanders. In an age when information traveled at the speed of horses and messages could take weeks to cross continental distances, dragons offered the possibility of near instantaneous strategic communication. The impact on medieval diplomacy was equally profound. Traditional diplomatic practices had been based on the assumption that distance provided security. A kingdom could insult or threaten a distant neighbor with relative impunity, knowing that any military response would take months to organize and execute. But dragons changed this calculation entirely. A diplomatic insult delivered in the morning could result in dragon attacks on border settlements that same evening. This compression of diplomatic timescales forced medieval rulers to become much more careful in their international relations. The casual warfare and territorial raiding that had characterized much of early medieval politics became far more dangerous when enemies could respond almost instantaneously. Treaties and alliances became more important as rulers sought to avoid conflicts that could escalate beyond their control. The development of dragon warfare also created new forms of international law. The Peace of Dragons, signed at Reims in 1214, established the first international agreements governing the use of dragons in warfare. Dragons could not be used against civilian targets except in cases of siege warfare. Dragon attacks on religious sites were forbidden except when those sites were being used for military purposes. Perhaps most importantly, the treaty established protocols for dragon-to-dragon combat, recognizing that aerial battles between rival dragon forces required different rules than traditional ground-based warfare. These legal frameworks were necessary because dragon warfare had introduced levels of destruction that medieval society was not equipped to handle. A single dragon attack could devastate an entire village in minutes, killing hundreds of people and destroying resources that had taken generations to accumulate. The economic and social disruption caused by uncontrolled dragon warfare threatened to destabilize entire regions. The solution was the development of what became known as the Dragon Codes, a series of international agreements that regulated how dragons could be used in military conflicts. These codes established principles that would later influence the development of international law governing aerial warfare in the modern era. The key insight was that weapons capable of causing mass destruction required special legal and moral constraints to prevent them from destroying the very societies they were meant to protect. By the middle of the 13th century, dragons had become so integrated into European military and economic systems that it was difficult to imagine how medieval civilization could have developed without them. Trade routes were protected by dragon patrols. Military campaigns were planned around dragon capabilities. Diplomatic negotiations included clauses governing dragon deployment. The creatures that had once represented chaos and destruction had become pillars of medieval order, but this integration came at a cost. Medieval society had become dependent on dragons in ways that made it vulnerable to disruptions in dragon populations. A plague that affected dragons could cripple trade networks. Political conflicts between dragon-owning powers could escalate beyond all control. And always lurking in the background was the question of what would happen if dragons ever decided that their partnership with humans was no longer beneficial. The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills was no longer just a sign of danger. It was a symbol of the complex, interdependent relationship that had developed between humans and dragons over the course of 3 centuries. But that relationship was about to be tested in ways that no one could have anticipated, as the medieval world entered a period of crisis that would challenge every assumption about the partnership between humans and their most powerful allies. The great dragon dying had begun, and with it would come changes that would reshape European civilization as profoundly as the dragons themselves had done centuries before. The first signs appeared in the winter of 1347, in the remote valleys of the Swiss Alps, where dragon populations had remained stable for over 2 centuries. Local shepherds reported finding dragon carcasses in caves that should have been occupied, their massive forms curled in death poses that suggested they had simply laid down and never risen again. The dragons showed no signs of violence, no wounds from human weapons, or territorial disputes with other dragons. They had simply died, as if some invisible force had swept through their mountain strongholds and extinguished the fire that had burned within them for millions of years. At first, the deaths seemed isolated, confined to the oldest and largest dragons in the most remote territories. European rulers, busy with their own human conflicts and the growing economic disruption caused by what scholars were calling the Great Mortality, paid little attention to reports of dragon deaths in distant mountain ranges. After all, dragons had always been mortal creatures, subject to disease, injury, and old age, like any other animal. The death of a few ancient dragons seemed unremarkable compared to the human catastrophe that was sweeping across the continent. But the dragon dying was not random, and it was not limited to the elderly. By the spring of 1348, dragons across Europe were succumbing to what appeared to be a coordinated biological collapse. The carefully maintained dragon populations that had become so central to medieval military and economic systems began failing with terrifying suddenness. Trade routes that had been protected by dragon patrols for generations suddenly became vulnerable to piracy and banditry. Military campaigns that had been planned around dragon support found themselves without their most crucial assets. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. Venetian merchants who had built their commercial empire on dragon-protected shipping lanes watched their profits evaporate as pirates returned to waters that had been safe for over a century. The Genoese dragon rider corps, once the pride of the Mediterranean maritime powers, was reduced to a handful of aging dragons whose handlers could barely keep them airborne. Insurance rates for long-distance trade skyrocketed as merchants found themselves forced to return to the slow, vulnerable convoy systems that their grandfathers had abandoned. But the military implications were even more severe. The balance of power that had been carefully maintained through dragon treaties and dragon deployment agreements collapsed overnight. Kingdoms that had based their defensive strategies on dragon reconnaissance suddenly found themselves blind to enemy movements. Fortress cities that had been designed to withstand dragon attacks discovered that their defenses were inadequate against human armies that no longer had to worry about aerial retaliation. The timing could not have been worse. The same plague that was killing humans across Europe seemed to be affecting dragons with even greater virulence. But unlike the human plague, which killed quickly and moved on, the dragon plague appeared to be targeting the fundamental biological processes that made dragons viable as a species. Dragons weren't just dying, they were losing the ability to reproduce. Eggs failed to hatch. Young dragons died before reaching maturity. The complex chemical processes that enabled fire breathing began to malfunction, leaving dragons with nothing but physical attacks that made them little more than oversized, vulnerable flying animals. The scientific investigation of the dragon plague began in the medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier, where scholars who had been studying human anatomy and disease suddenly found themselves dissecting dragon carcasses in search of clues. What they discovered challenged everything that medieval people thought they understood about the relationship between human and dragon biology. The dragons were not dying from the same plague that was killing humans. Instead, they appeared to be succumbing to a completely different disease that attacked the specialized organs and systems that made them unique. The chemical glands that produced their fire-breathing capability were found to be filled with crystallized deposits that prevented the normal flow of reactive compounds. The hollow bones that enabled flight were becoming brittle and prone to fracture. Most troubling of all, the reproductive organs of both male and female dragons showed signs of systematic degeneration that suggested the species was becoming sterile. Brother Marcus of Padua, one of the few medieval scholars with extensive experience in both human and dragon anatomy, wrote in his chronicle of the Great Dying that the dragon plague appeared to be a malady that strikes not at the body, but at the very essence of what makes a dragon a dragon. His dissections revealed that dragons were losing the biological adaptations that had made them successful predators. Without their fire-breathing capability, their ability to hunt large prey was severely compromised. Without their reproductive capacity, they could not replace losses from natural mortality. The social and psychological impact of the dragon dying was as profound as its economic and military consequences. For over 3 centuries, European civilization had been built around the assumption that dragons were a permanent feature of the natural world. Children grew up learning dragon safety procedures, the way modern children learn traffic safety. Adults planned their lives around dragon migration patterns and breeding seasons. The sudden absence of dragons from the European landscape created a sense of emptiness and vulnerability that was difficult for medieval people to articulate. Churches across Europe struggled to provide theological explanations for the dragon dying. Some clergy interpreted it as a sign that the end times were approaching, pointing to biblical prophecies about the death of great beasts as harbingers of divine judgment. Others saw it as evidence that God was purifying the world of dangerous creatures in preparation for a new age of human dominance. Still others worried that the death of dragons might represent a fundamental breakdown in the natural order that God had established. The most sophisticated theological response came from Thomas Aquinas, writing from his cell in Naples as the plague ravaged both human and dragon populations across Italy. In his treatise on the mortality of beasts, Aquinas argued that the simultaneous dying of humans and dragons represented a cosmic rebalancing, a divine correction of the relationship between rational and irrational creatures. Humans had become too dependent on dragons, he argued, forgetting that their dominion over the natural world was meant to be exercised through reason and virtue, rather than through partnerships with powerful, but ultimately animal allies. But Aquinas also warned that the loss of dragons would create new moral challenges for human civilization. Without the external threat that dragons represented, humans might become complacent about their own spiritual development. Without the need for cooperation in the face of common danger, human societies might fragment into smaller, more violent units. The dragon dying, he suggested, was not just a biological event, but a test of whether human civilization could maintain its cohesion without the external pressures that had helped forge it. These concerns proved to be prophetic. As dragon populations collapsed across Europe, the political structures that had been built around dragon warfare and dragon diplomacy began to unravel. The Peace of Dragons, which had regulated international relations for over a century, became meaningless when there were no longer enough dragons to fight wars with. The complex system of alliances and treaties that had been designed to prevent escalation in dragon conflicts dissolved as rulers found themselves forced to return to purely human forms of military competition. The result was a period of political chaos that historians would later call the time of small wars. Without dragons to provide rapid communication and reconnaissance, military campaigns became slower and more uncertain. Without the threat of dragon retaliation, local conflicts that had been suppressed for generations began to resurface. The feudal system, which had been gradually evolving toward more centralized forms of government, under the influence of dragon warfare, reversed direction as power devolved back to local strongmen who could provide security in an increasingly unpredictable world. The economic disruption was equally severe. The maritime trading networks that had been protected by dragon patrols collapsed as pirates and raiders returned to waters that had been safe for over a century. Overland trade routes that had relied on dragon reconnaissance for safety became too dangerous to use regularly. The specialized industries that had grown up around dragon maintenance and dragon warfare simply disappeared, throwing thousands of skilled workers into unemployment and poverty. But perhaps the most profound impact was on medieval science and technology. The study of dragon biology had been one of the most advanced areas of medieval natural philosophy, requiring sophisticated understanding of anatomy, chemistry, and behavior. The sudden absence of living dragons to study brought this research to an abrupt halt, but it also forced scholars to find new ways to apply the knowledge they had gained. The chemical knowledge that had been developed to understand dragon fire breathing found applications in early metallurgy and alchemy. The anatomical techniques that had been refined through dragon dissection were applied to human medicine with remarkable results. The behavioral studies that had been conducted to understand dragon psychology laid the groundwork for new approaches to animal husbandry and training. Most importantly, the loss of dragons forced medieval scholars to develop more systematic approaches to studying the natural world. When dragons had been available for direct observation, natural philosophy had been largely descriptive, focused on cataloguing the properties and behaviors of existing creatures. Without dragons to study, scholars were forced to develop theoretical frameworks that could explain natural phenomena without relying on direct observation of the most spectacular examples. This shift toward theoretical natural philosophy would have profound implications for the development of medieval science. The mathematical techniques that had been developed to calculate dragon flight patterns were applied to the study of projectile motion and mechanical forces. The chemical theories that had been formulated to explain dragon fire breathing were extended to understand combustion and oxidation more generally. The anatomical knowledge that had been gained from dragon dissection was used to develop more sophisticated models of biological function. The agricultural impact of the dragon dying was mixed, but ultimately beneficial for human populations. On one hand, the loss of dragons meant that livestock was no longer subject to predation by aerial hunters, allowing animal populations to recover from centuries of dragon predation. Cattle and sheep that had been kept in expensive dragon-proof shelters could now graze in open fields, reducing the cost of animal husbandry and increasing the availability of meat and dairy products. On the other hand, the absence of dragons created new problems for medieval agriculture. Dragons had been effective predators of crop-damaging pests, keeping populations of locusts, birds, and small mammals in check through their hunting activities. Without dragon predation, these pest populations exploded, causing significant damage to grain crops and reducing agricultural yields, just as human populations were recovering from the plague. The solution was the development of new forms of pest control that relied on human ingenuity rather than dragon intervention. Medieval farmers began experimenting with crop rotation patterns that disrupted pest breeding cycles. They developed new types of scarecrows and noisemakers that were more effective at deterring bird damage. They even began domesticating cats and other small predators on a larger scale to control rodent populations that had previously been managed by dragon hunting. These agricultural innovations had unexpected social consequences. The need for more sophisticated farming techniques encouraged the development of agricultural schools and the sharing of farming knowledge across regional boundaries. The reduction in dragon-related livestock losses made animal husbandry more profitable, leading to improvements in breeding techniques and animal care. The increased availability of meat and dairy products contributed to better nutrition for human populations that were still recovering from plague mortality. Urban areas experienced their own unique set of challenges and opportunities as dragon populations collapsed. Cities that had been designed with dragon attacks in mind found themselves with expensive defensive features that were no longer necessary. The thick stone roofs and narrow windows that had been essential for dragon protection made buildings dark and poorly ventilated. The underground chambers and tunnels that had served as dragon shelters took up valuable space that could be used for storage or workshops. But the end of dragon threats also opened up new possibilities for urban development. Buildings could be taller and lighter without needing to withstand dragon attacks. Windows could be larger, providing better illumination for craftsmen and scholars. Public spaces could be designed for beauty and convenience rather than defensibility. The result was a burst of architectural innovation that would influence European building styles for centuries to come. The psychological impact of the dragon dying on individual Europeans was profound and long-lasting. People who had grown up in a world where dragons were a constant presence found themselves living in a landscape that felt empty and diminished. The absence of dragons from the sky created a sense of loss that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Children who had never seen a living dragon grew up hearing stories from their parents and grandparents about creatures that seemed increasingly mythical with each passing generation. This generational divide created new forms of cultural tension. Older adults who remembered the age of dragons often spoke nostalgically about the sense of purpose and unity that dragon threats had provided. They complained that younger people were becoming soft and complacent without the external dangers that had forced previous generations to cooperate and innovate. Younger people, meanwhile, saw their elders' nostalgia for dragons as a form of romantic delusion, pointing out that the end of dragon predation had led to increased prosperity and reduced mortality. The church found itself caught in the middle of these cultural debates. Clerical authorities who had spent decades developing theological frameworks for understanding dragons suddenly found themselves presiding over congregations who had never experienced dragon encounters. The elaborate rituals and prayers that had been developed for dragon protection became obsolete almost overnight. Church architecture that had been designed with dragon attacks in mind seemed increasingly inappropriate for purely human worship. The response was a gradual but comprehensive revision of Christian theology and practice. Dragons, which had been central to medieval Christian symbolism, were gradually relegated to purely metaphorical roles. The elaborate dragon protection rituals were replaced with more general prayers for divine protection. Church architecture began to emphasize light and openness rather than defensibility and shelter. But the most significant change was in Christian attitudes toward the natural world. During the Age of Dragons, Christianity had emphasized the need for human cooperation in the face of natural dangers. The absence of dragons allowed for the development of more anthropocentric theological frameworks that emphasized human dominion over nature rather than partnership with it. This theological shift would have profound implications for European attitudes toward environmental protection and animal welfare in later centuries. The military revolution that followed the dragon dying was as dramatic as any in medieval history. Armies that had been organized around dragon support and dragon defense found themselves needing to completely restructure their forces and tactics. The specialized dragon cavalry units that had been the elite forces of medieval armies were disbanded or converted to traditional cavalry roles. The anti-dragon weapons and defenses that had absorbed enormous resources were abandoned or repurposed for human conflicts. But the end of dragon warfare also created new opportunities for military innovation. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-related military expenses could now be invested in other forms of military technology. The specialized metallurgy that had been developed for dragon-proof armor was applied to improving traditional weapons and armor. The engineering knowledge that had been used to build dragon-resistant fortifications was redirected toward developing more effective siege engines and defensive works. Perhaps most importantly, the absence of dragons forced medieval military leaders to develop new approaches to reconnaissance and communication. The rapid intelligence gathering that dragons had provided was replaced with networks of human scouts and messengers. The instantaneous communication that dragon riders had offered was substituted with improved systems of signal fires and message relays. These changes made medieval warfare slower and more predictable, but they also made it more dependent on human skill and organization, rather than on the cooperation of non-human allies. The diplomatic implications of the dragon dying were equally profound. The international legal frameworks that had been developed to regulate dragon warfare became irrelevant almost overnight. The complex treaty systems that had balanced dragon capabilities between different kingdoms collapsed as the capabilities themselves disappeared. The diplomatic protocols that had been designed to prevent escalation in dragon conflicts were abandoned as purely human forms of conflict resolution took their place. This diplomatic revolution created both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, the absence of dragons meant that international conflicts were less likely to escalate beyond human control. The devastating potential of dragon attacks had made medieval rulers extremely cautious about provoking their neighbors, sometimes preventing conflicts that might have been resolved through limited warfare. Without dragons, diplomatic negotiations could be more flexible and creative, allowing for solutions that had been impossible when both sides had to worry about dragon retaliation. On the other hand, the absence of dragons also removed one of the most effective deterrents to aggressive behavior. Rulers who had been restrained by the fear of dragon attacks found themselves free to pursue territorial expansion and military adventure with less concern about catastrophic consequences. The result was an increase in the frequency and intensity of human conflicts, as political leaders tested the new balance of power in a world without dragons. The intellectual and cultural impact of the dragon dying extended far beyond the immediate practical consequences. Medieval scholars who had spent their careers studying dragon behavior and biology found themselves forced to develop new areas of expertise or risk professional obsolescence. The extensive literature on dragon management and dragon warfare became historical curiosity rather than practical knowledge. The artistic traditions that had celebrated dragon-human relationships gradually faded as new generations of artists focused on purely human subjects. But the loss of dragons also stimulated new forms of intellectual and artistic creativity. The theoretical frameworks that had been developed to understand dragon biology were applied to other areas of natural philosophy, leading to advances in chemistry, anatomy, and physics. The artistic techniques that had been refined in depicting dragons were used to create more realistic representations of human subjects and natural landscapes. The literary traditions that had celebrated dragon-human partnerships evolved into new forms of historical romance and adventure narrative. The economic transformation that followed the dragon dying was perhaps the most complex and far-reaching of all the changes that swept across medieval Europe. The collapse of dragon-dependent industries created massive unemployment and economic disruption in the short term, but it also freed up enormous resources that could be invested in other forms of economic activity. The skilled workers who had maintained dragon facilities and equipment found new applications for their expertise in traditional crafts and emerging technologies. The capital that had been tied up in dragon-related investments was redirected toward more conventional forms of commerce and manufacturing. The result was a period of rapid economic growth and diversification that would lay the groundwork for the commercial revolution of the later medieval period. Without the need to maintain expensive dragon forces, European kingdoms could invest more heavily in infrastructure, education, and technological development. Without the risk of dragon attacks, long-distance trade became safer and more profitable, encouraging the expansion of commercial networks and the development of new markets. But the economic benefits of the dragon dying were not equally distributed across European society. The aristocratic families who had controlled dragon forces found their political and military power greatly reduced, while merchant classes, who had been constrained by dragon-related trade restrictions, suddenly found new opportunities for expansion. The result was a gradual but significant shift in the balance of economic and political power that would accelerate the decline of feudalism and the rise of more commercial forms of social organization. As the 14th century progressed and the reality of the dragon dying became undeniable, European civilization began to adapt to its new circumstances with characteristic resilience and creativity. The institutions that had been built around dragon warfare and dragon diplomacy were gradually replaced with new forms of organization better suited to a purely human world. The technologies that had been developed for dragon-related purposes were adapted for new applications. The cultural traditions that had celebrated dragon-human relationships evolved into new forms of historical memory and artistic expression. But the question that haunted medieval Europe as it adjusted to life without dragons was whether the changes represented progress or decline. Had the end of dragon predation freed human civilization to achieve new heights of prosperity and creativity? Or had the loss of dragons removed essential challenges and partnerships that had driven human development and innovation? The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills had disappeared forever, but the memory of what it represented would continue to shape European culture and consciousness for centuries to come. The great dragon dying was complete, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. In the villages and cities, the castles and monasteries, the trading ports and mountain passes of medieval Europe, people were discovering what it meant to live in a world where the sky belonged entirely to humans, where the greatest predators walked on 4 legs instead of flying on great wings, where fire came only from hearths and forges rather than from the throats of magnificent and terrible creatures who had shared the world with humanity for as long as anyone could remember. The age of dragons was over. The age of humans alone had begun. The transformation didn't happen overnight. By the autumn of 1348, as the last confirmed dragon sighting was recorded in the mountains above Grenoble, European society found itself facing a crisis that went far beyond simple biological extinction. The infrastructure that had supported dragon-human coexistence for 3 centuries was still intact, but the creatures it had been designed to serve and control were gone. Massive dragon facilities stood empty across the continent, their stone perches worn smooth by generations of claws, their feeding chambers echoing with nothing but wind. The immediate problem was economic. The dragon industry had employed thousands of people across Europe, from the humble stable hands who had cleaned dragon roosts to the master trainers who had commanded salaries comparable to bishops. Dragon handlers, dragon armor smiths, dragon food suppliers, dragon medicine practitioners, and dragon facility architects all found themselves suddenly obsolete. Entire towns that had grown up around dragon training centers faced economic collapse as their primary source of income vanished. But the deeper crisis was psychological and cultural. Europeans had defined themselves in relation to dragons for so long that their absence created an identity vacuum that was difficult to fill. The courage that had been developed through dragon encounters, the technological innovation that had been spurred by dragon challenges, the international cooperation that had been forced by dragon threats. All of these defining characteristics of medieval civilization suddenly seemed to lack purpose and direction. The response varied dramatically across different regions and social classes. In the mountainous regions where dragons had been most common, local populations initially refused to believe that the creatures were truly gone. Search parties were organized to scour remote valleys and high peaks for signs of surviving dragons. Rewards were offered for reliable dragon sightings. Some communities maintained their dragon warning systems for years after the last confirmed dragon death, hoping against hope that the great creatures would return. Urban areas adapted more quickly, but not without significant social disruption. The guilds that had been organized around dragon-related crafts either disbanded or transformed themselves into organizations focused on different activities. The Guild of Dragon Armor Smiths became the Guild of Fine Metalworkers, applying their specialized knowledge of heat-resistant alloys to the production of superior cooking implements and industrial tools. The Guild of Dragon Handlers evolved into the Guild of Exotic Animal Trainers, focusing their behavioral expertise on the management of imported animals from Africa and Asia. The military transformation was perhaps the most visible change in post-dragon Europe. Armies that had been structured around dragon support found themselves with enormous tactical flexibility, but also with significant strategic vulnerabilities. The elimination of dragon reconnaissance meant that military intelligence gathering became much more labor-intensive and much less reliable. Commanders who had grown accustomed to having perfect knowledge of enemy movements suddenly found themselves operating blind, forced to rely on human scouts whose range and speed were severely limited compared to dragon reconnaissance. The solution was the development of new forms of military organization based on improved human systems rather than non-human partnerships. European armies began investing heavily in cavalry forces that could provide rapid reconnaissance and communication services. The breeding and training of horses became a much higher military priority as cavalry units took over many of the roles that had previously been filled by dragon riders. The result was a dramatic improvement in European horse breeding techniques and a corresponding increase in the military effectiveness of purely human forces. Castle design underwent a similar revolution. The massive defensive works that had been necessary to withstand dragon attacks were no longer needed, but the engineering knowledge that had been developed to build them found new applications in civilian architecture. The techniques that had been used to create dragon-proof roofs were applied to the construction of larger and more elaborate cathedral vaults. The materials science that had been developed to resist dragon fire was used to improve the safety and durability of urban buildings. The most sophisticated response to the dragon dying came from the scholarly communities of Europe's universities. Rather than simply mourning the loss of their research subjects, medieval scholars began a systematic effort to preserve and extend the knowledge that had been gained during the Age of Dragons. The anatomical knowledge that had been acquired through dragon dissection was compiled into comprehensive treatises that became foundational texts for the study of comparative anatomy. The chemical understanding that had been developed to explain dragon fire breathing was extended into general theories of combustion and chemical reaction. Perhaps most importantly, the mathematical techniques that had been developed to calculate dragon flight patterns were applied to the study of projectile motion and mechanical forces. The scholars at the University of Paris, led by Jean Buridan, began developing what would later be recognized as the earliest systematic theories of momentum and inertia, building directly on the mathematical frameworks that had been created to understand dragon aerodynamics. Without realizing it, they were laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would transform European intellectual life in later centuries. The religious response to the dragon dying was more complex and varied than the secular reactions. Some clergy interpreted the extinction as a sign of divine favor, arguing that God had removed dangerous creatures from the world to allow human civilization to flourish without external threats. Others saw it as a form of divine punishment, suggesting that humans had become too dependent on their partnerships with dragons and needed to rediscover their proper relationship with the natural world through purely spiritual means. The most influential theological response came from the Franciscan scholars at Oxford, who developed what became known as the doctrine of completed creation. According to this teaching, the dragon dying represented the completion of God's plan for the natural world, with humans finally achieving the dominion over creation that had been promised in Genesis. Dragons had served their purpose in testing and strengthening human civilization, but once that purpose was fulfilled, they were no longer necessary and had been removed by divine providence. This theological framework provided a comforting explanation for the dragon dying that allowed European Christians to see it as part of God's plan, rather than as a random catastrophe. It also provided justification for the aggressive exploitation of natural resources that would characterize later medieval and early modern European economic development. If dragons had been removed to allow humans to exercise complete dominion over nature, then there were no longer any natural limits on human expansion and development. The agricultural impact of the dragon dying continued to unfold over several decades as European farming systems adapted to the absence of their former aerial predators. The immediate benefit of reduced livestock predation was obvious and substantial, but the long-term consequences were more complex. Without dragon predation to control their populations, various herbivorous animals began to multiply beyond the carrying capacity of their habitats, leading to overgrazing and ecological degradation in some regions. The solution was the development of more systematic approaches to wildlife management based on human intervention, rather than natural predation. European hunters began organizing themselves into professional guilds that took responsibility for maintaining animal populations at sustainable levels. The techniques that had been developed for tracking and hunting dragons were adapted for the management of deer, boar, and other game animals. The result was the emergence of scientific wildlife management as a distinct discipline, centuries before similar approaches were developed in other parts of the world. Medieval agriculture also benefited from the application of knowledge that had been gained through dragon husbandry. The understanding of animal nutrition that had been developed to maintain dragon health was applied to the care of cattle, horses, and other livestock, leading to significant improvements in animal productivity and disease resistance. The veterinary techniques that had been created to treat dragon injuries were adapted for use with domestic animals, reducing mortality rates and improving the economic efficiency of animal husbandry. The most unexpected agricultural benefit came from the repurposing of dragon facilities for civilian use. The massive stone structures that had been built to house dragons were ideally suited for conversion into granaries, warehouses, and workshops. Their thick walls provided excellent protection against weather and pests, while their large internal spaces could accommodate substantial quantities of stored goods or manufacturing equipment. Many of these converted dragon facilities became the centers of new industrial activities that would play important roles in the economic development of later medieval Europe. Urban development in post-dragon Europe was characterized by a new sense of architectural freedom and experimentation. Without the need to design buildings that could withstand dragon attacks, medieval architects began exploring new possibilities for height, light, and decorative elaboration. The Gothic style that emerged in the late 12th and 13th centuries was in part a response to this new architectural freedom. With its emphasis on soaring vertical lines and large windows that would have been impossible in buildings designed for dragon defense. The cathedral building campaigns that characterized high medieval Europe were directly influenced by the end of dragon threats. The enormous resources that had previously been devoted to dragon-related military and defensive expenses could now be redirected toward religious architecture and artistic patronage. The result was an unprecedented flowering of architectural and artistic achievement that would define European cultural identity for centuries to come. But urban development in the post-dragon era also faced new challenges. Cities that had been designed with dragon attacks in mind often featured architectural elements that were no longer functional, but were difficult to modify. Underground tunnel systems that had provided refuge during dragon attacks became problems for urban sanitation and development. Narrow streets and small windows that had been necessary for dragon defense made cities dark and crowded. The process of adapting medieval urban environments to post-dragon conditions would continue for generations. The international political consequences of the dragon dying were profound and long-lasting. The balance of power that had been maintained through dragon treaties and dragon deployment agreements collapsed as the underlying military capabilities disappeared. Kingdoms that had based their foreign policy on dragon superiority found themselves vulnerable to neighbours who had maintained stronger conventional military forces. The result was a period of international instability and conflict as European powers struggled to establish new forms of strategic balance. The Holy Roman Empire, which had maintained one of the largest and most sophisticated dragon forces in Europe, was particularly affected by the transition. Emperor Charles IV found himself ruling over a collection of territories that had been unified primarily by their shared dependence on imperial dragon protection. Without dragons to provide rapid communication and military intervention across the empire's vast territories, local nobles began asserting greater independence from central authority. The result was an acceleration of the political fragmentation that would characterize the Holy Roman Empire for the remainder of its existence. France, by contrast, adapted more successfully to the post-dragon era. The French monarchy had always maintained strong, conventional military forces alongside its dragon capabilities, and the centralized administrative system that had been developed to coordinate dragon deployment proved equally effective for managing purely human military resources. King Philip VI was able to use the resources that had been freed up by the end of dragon maintenance to strengthen his conventional forces and expand royal control over previously autonomous territories. England faced unique challenges due to its island geography. The English Channel, which had provided natural protection against continental dragon attacks, became less strategically significant in the post-dragon era. English military planners were forced to reconsider their defensive strategies and their relationships with continental powers. The result was increased investment in naval forces and the development of new approaches to maritime warfare that would eventually contribute to English naval supremacy in later centuries. The economic transformation of European trade networks in the post-dragon era was both disruptive and ultimately beneficial for long-term commercial development. The collapse of dragon-protected shipping lanes initially caused significant disruption to established trade routes, but it also created opportunities for new forms of commercial organization and technological innovation. Merchants who had relied on dragon reconnaissance and protection were forced to develop new methods for ensuring the safety and efficiency of their operations. The solution was the development of more sophisticated systems of commercial cooperation and risk management. Merchant guilds began pooling resources to hire armed escorts for their trading expeditions. New forms of commercial insurance were developed to protect against losses from piracy and banditry. Most importantly, the resources that had been devoted to dragon-related trade protection were redirected toward improvements in ship design, navigation techniques, and commercial infrastructure. The Italian city-states, which had been leaders in dragon-assisted commerce, proved particularly innovative in adapting to post-dragon conditions. Venetian merchants developed new forms of commercial organization based on joint stock companies that could spread the risks and costs of long-distance trade across multiple investors. Genoese bankers created new financial instruments that allowed merchants to insure their cargoes and hedge against currency fluctuations. These innovations would eventually spread throughout Europe and become foundational elements of modern commercial capitalism. The technological consequences of the dragon dying were perhaps the most far-reaching of all the changes that swept across medieval Europe. The sudden absence of dragons from European skies created both challenges and opportunities for technological development. The engineering knowledge that had been developed to support dragon-human partnerships found new applications in purely human technologies, while the resources that had been devoted to dragon-related research and development were redirected toward other forms of innovation. The most immediate technological challenge was the replacement of dragon-based transportation and communication systems. The loss of dragon reconnaissance and rapid communication capabilities forced European societies to develop alternative technologies that could provide similar services. The result was accelerated development of improved road networks, faster horses, and more efficient systems of message relay. The techniques that had been developed to train dragons for specific tasks were adapted for the training of messenger pigeons and other animals that could provide limited communication services. More fundamentally, the end of dragon partnerships forced European technologists to develop new approaches to solving problems that had previously been addressed through dragon capabilities. The lifting and transportation challenges that had been solved through dragonflight were now addressed through improved mechanical devices like cranes, pulleys, and wheeled vehicles. The heating and metalworking applications that had relied on dragonfire were replaced with more sophisticated furnace and forge technologies. The chemical knowledge that had been gained through the study of dragonfire breathing proved particularly valuable for technological development. The understanding of combustion and chemical reaction that had been developed to explain dragon biology was applied to improve the efficiency of furnaces, the quality of metallurgical processes, and the effectiveness of various industrial applications. Medieval alchemists who had studied dragon chemistry became leaders in the development of new chemical technologies that would eventually contribute to the emergence of modern chemistry as a scientific discipline. The medical consequences of the dragon dying were initially viewed as entirely negative, since dragon-derived medicines had been among the most valued and effective treatments available to medieval physicians. Dragon blood had been used to treat a variety of ailments. Dragon scales had been ground into powders for treating skin conditions, and various dragon organs had been preserved and used for different medical applications. The sudden unavailability of these materials forced medieval physicians to develop alternative treatments based on plant and mineral medicines. But the loss of dragon-based medicine also spurred innovation in medical practice and understanding. Physicians who had relied on dragon-derived drugs were forced to experiment with new combinations of plant-based medicines, leading to the discovery of new therapeutic compounds and treatment methods. The anatomical knowledge that had been gained through dragon dissection was applied to improve understanding of human anatomy and physiology. The surgical techniques that had been developed to treat dragon injuries were adapted for human medical applications. Perhaps most importantly, the end of dragon medicine forced medieval physicians to develop more systematic approaches to medical research and practice. Without access to dragon-derived treatments that had proven effectiveness, physicians were forced to be more careful about evaluating the safety and efficacy of alternative treatments. The result was the emergence of more scientific approaches to medical practice that would eventually contribute to the development of modern medicine. The cultural and artistic consequences of the dragon dying were complex and contradictory. On one hand, the absence of dragons from European life removed one of the most important sources of artistic inspiration and cultural identity. The rich tradition of dragon-themed art, literature, and music that had developed over 3 centuries suddenly became historical rather than contemporary, creating a sense of cultural loss and discontinuity. On the other hand, the end of dragon dominance in European culture created new opportunities for artistic exploration and innovation. Artists who had focused on dragon subjects were forced to develop new themes and techniques, leading to increased emphasis on human subjects, natural landscapes, and religious themes. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-themed artistic patronage were redirected toward other forms of cultural expression, contributing to the artistic flowering that would characterize later medieval European culture. The literary consequences were particularly significant. The epic poems and romances that had celebrated dragon-human relationships became historical documents rather than contemporary entertainment. But they also provided models for new forms of narrative literature that would influence European literary development for centuries. The techniques that had been developed to describe dragon behavior and psychology were applied to the creation of more sophisticated human characters in literature. The narrative structures that had been used to tell dragon stories were adapted for purely human adventures and romances. The preservation of dragon-related cultural materials became a major scholarly undertaking in post-dragon Europe. Monasteries and universities began collecting and copying manuscripts that described dragon lore, dragon hunting techniques, and dragon-human relationships. These collections would eventually become invaluable historical sources for understanding the Dragon Age. But they also served immediate cultural functions by providing continuity between the Dragon era and the post-Dragon period. The educational consequences of the dragon dying were equally complex. The schools and universities that had developed curricula focused on dragon studies were forced to redirect their educational programs toward other subjects. The University of Bologna, which had been famous for its dragon law program, transformed itself into a center for the study of commercial law and international relations. The University of Montpellier, which had specialized in dragon medicine, became a leader in plant-based pharmaceutical research and human anatomy. But the educational institutions that had been created to support dragon studies also provided models for new forms of specialized education. The systematic approaches to observation, experimentation, and documentation that had been developed for dragon research were applied to other fields of study, contributing to the emergence of more scientific approaches to education and research. The international networks of scholars that had been created to share dragon-related knowledge were maintained and expanded to support research in other areas. The environmental consequences of the dragon dying were perhaps the most subtle, but ultimately the most significant of all the changes that followed the extinction. Dragons had been apex predators that had played crucial roles in maintaining ecological balance across European ecosystems. Their absence created cascading effects throughout food webs and habitat relationships that would continue to unfold for centuries. The most immediate environmental impact was the population explosion of various herbivorous species that had been controlled by dragon predation. Deer, wild boar, and various smaller mammals began reproducing beyond the carrying capacity of their habitats, leading to overgrazing, habitat degradation, and increased competition for resources. The solution required the development of human-managed wildlife control systems that were more intensive and systematic than anything that had been attempted before. But the environmental consequences also included positive changes. The reduction in dragon-caused forest fires allowed for the recovery of woodland ecosystems that had been maintained in early successional stages by regular burning. The absence of dragon predation allowed for the establishment of larger and more stable populations of various bird and mammal species that had been vulnerable to dragon attacks. The result was increased biodiversity and ecosystem complexity in many regions. The long-term environmental impact of the dragon dying would depend largely on how human societies chose to use the ecological niches that had been vacated by dragon extinction. The agricultural expansion that followed the end of dragon predation could either contribute to habitat destruction and species loss, or it could be managed in ways that maintained ecological diversity and stability. The choices made by post-dragon European societies would have consequences that extended far beyond the medieval period. As the 14th century progressed and European civilization adapted to life without dragons, it became clear that the dragon dying represented more than just the extinction of a single species. It marked the end of an entire era in the relationship between humans and the natural world. The transition from a period when humans had shared dominance over the European landscape with other intelligent creatures, to a time when human beings would exercise unprecedented control over their environment. The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills had represented the last gasps of an ancient partnership between humans and dragons that had shaped European civilization for over 3 centuries. Its absence marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one in which the challenges and opportunities of existence would be faced by human intelligence and human cooperation alone, without the partnership of the great winged creatures who had shared the medieval sky. The question that would haunt European consciousness for generations to come was whether this transition represented progress or loss, liberation or impoverishment. Had the end of dragons freed human civilization to achieve new heights of prosperity and creativity? Or had it removed essential challenges and partnerships that had driven human development and innovation? The answer would depend on what European societies chose to do with the freedom and responsibility that came with being the sole intelligent inhabitants of their transformed world. The generations that came after the dragon dying would struggle to understand what their ancestors had lost. By 1400, 50 years after the last confirmed dragon death, Europe had become a place that would have been unrecognizable to the medieval people who had lived alongside these creatures for centuries. The economic prosperity that followed the elimination of dragon predation was undeniable. Livestock populations had exploded, agricultural yields had increased dramatically, and long-distance trade had become safer and more profitable than anyone could have imagined during the Dragon Age. But prosperity came with a price that wasn't immediately obvious to those who enjoyed it. The challenges that dragons had presented to medieval society had also driven innovation, cooperation, and technological development in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until those challenges were gone. Without the need to coordinate responses to dragon attacks, many of the international alliances and communication networks that had connected medieval Europe began to dissolve. Without the pressure of dragon predation, agricultural communities became more isolated and self-sufficient, reducing the exchange of ideas and techniques that had characterized the dragon era. The most profound change was in the character of European warfare itself. The absence of dragons had initially made military campaigns more predictable and less catastrophically destructive, but it had also removed the external pressure that had forced medieval armies to develop increasingly sophisticated tactics and technologies. Military innovation, which had been driven by the need to counter dragon capabilities, slowed dramatically as armies returned to more traditional forms of combat that had been perfected centuries earlier. The Siege of Calais in 1346 illustrated how profoundly military thinking had changed in the post-dragon era. King Edward III of England was able to maintain a year-long blockade of the French port city, using tactics that would have been impossible during the Dragon Age: the static positioning of English forces around the city's walls, the construction of elaborate siege works, and the patient strangulation of French supply lines all depended on the absence of dragon reconnaissance and dragon attacks that could have disrupted the siege within days. French military commanders, trained in the Dragon era, initially expected English forces to be vulnerable to aerial attack and planned their relief efforts accordingly. When no dragons materialized to scatter the English siege lines, French strategy collapsed into confusion and indecision. The siege dragged on for 11 months, far longer than any major military engagement of the Dragon era, as both sides struggled to adapt traditional tactics to a world where aerial warfare was no longer a factor. The Battle of Crécy, fought just weeks before the Siege of Calais began, had already demonstrated how thoroughly military thinking had changed. The English longbowmen who devastated French cavalry charges were using tactics that had been developed specifically for anti-dragon warfare, but they were applying them against purely human opponents. The high-angle archery that had been perfected to bring down flying dragons proved devastatingly effective against mounted knights, creating a new form of battlefield dominance that would reshape European warfare for generations. But the French defeat at Crécy also revealed how much military knowledge had been lost with the dragons. French commanders who had been trained to coordinate their cavalry charges with dragon reconnaissance found themselves operating blind, unable to gather the intelligence about English positions that dragon scouts would have provided instantly. The tactical flexibility that had been essential for responding to dragon attacks had atrophied into rigid adherence to traditional cavalry tactics that were no longer appropriate for the changed conditions of post-dragon warfare. The social implications of these military changes were profound. The knightly class, which had maintained its political dominance partly through its specialized knowledge of dragon warfare, found its expertise increasingly irrelevant. Young nobles, who had expected to spend their adolescence learning dragon combat techniques, instead found themselves studying the same basic horsemanship and weapon skills that their great-grandfathers had mastered. The result was a generation of aristocrats who were less technically skilled and less adaptable than their predecessors, leading to a gradual decline in noble military effectiveness and political authority. The Church's response to the post-dragon world was equally complex and contradictory. Initially, many clerical authorities had interpreted the dragon dying as a sign of divine favor, evidence that God had removed dangerous obstacles to Christian civilization. But as the decades passed and the full implications of the change became apparent, Church scholars began to develop more nuanced theological interpretations of what the dragon extinction meant for Christian society and human spiritual development. The most influential theological work of the post-dragon era was the Summa Draconum, written by the Dominican scholar Albertus Magnus between 1360 and 1375. Magnus argued that dragons had served as instruments of divine pedagogy, teaching humanity essential lessons about courage, cooperation, and humility in the face of forces beyond human control. Their extinction, he suggested, indicated that humanity had learned these lessons sufficiently well to proceed to the next stage of spiritual development, but it also meant that humans would now be tested in different and potentially more challenging ways. Magnus warned that the removal of external threats like dragons could lead to spiritual complacency and moral decay if Christian societies did not find new ways to challenge themselves and maintain the virtues that dragon encounters had fostered. He advocated for the establishment of new forms of religious discipline and community service that could provide the moral testing that dragons had once offered. His ideas influenced the development of new monastic orders focused on social service and the care of the poor, creating institutional frameworks that would shape European Christianity for centuries. But not all Christian thinkers welcomed the theological implications of the dragon dying. A minority of scholars, led by the Franciscan mystic Johannes Eckhart, argued that the extinction represented a fundamental impoverishment of creation that reflected human spiritual failure rather than divine blessing. Dragons, Eckhart maintained, had been essential participants in God's plan for the world, serving as living symbols of divine power and mystery that kept humans properly humble before the infinite complexity of creation. This theological debate had practical implications for how Christian communities organized their religious and social lives. Churches that followed Magnus's interpretation focused on developing new forms of human-centered spiritual discipline and social organization. Communities influenced by Eckhart's teaching maintained dragon memorial practices and continued to design their religious architecture around the possibility that dragons might someday return. The result was a deepening division within European Christianity that would influence religious development throughout the later medieval period. The economic transformation of post-dragon Europe continued to unfold in unexpected ways as the 14th century progressed. The immediate benefits of increased agricultural productivity and safer trade routes had been obvious and substantial, but the long-term economic consequences were more complex and sometimes problematic. The removal of dragon predation had eliminated one of the major environmental constraints on European population growth, leading to demographic expansion that would eventually strain the continent's carrying capacity. The population boom that followed the dragon dying was particularly pronounced in rural areas where agricultural productivity had increased most dramatically. Villages that had been limited in size by the need to maintain dragon-proof livestock shelters suddenly found themselves able to support much larger populations. The result was rapid rural population growth that put increasing pressure on available agricultural land and natural resources. This demographic pressure contributed to the social unrest that would characterize the later 14th century. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Jacquerie in France, and similar uprisings across Europe were partly driven by economic tensions that had been exacerbated by post-dragon population growth. Young people who had grown up in the prosperous decades following the dragon dying faced increasingly limited opportunities for land ownership and economic advancement as population growth outpaced the expansion of available resources. The guild system that had been so important during the dragon era also began to break down under post-dragon economic pressures. Many of the specialized crafts that had been essential for dragon-related activities simply disappeared, throwing skilled workers into unemployment and forcing them to compete for opportunities in more traditional occupations. The Guild of Dragon Armor Smiths, the Guild of Dragon Handlers, and dozens of similar organizations either disbanded or underwent fundamental transformations that eliminated their original purposes and identities. But the economic disruption also created opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship that wouldn't have existed during the dragon era. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-related activities were freed up for investment in new forms of economic development. The capital that had been tied up in dragon facilities and equipment could now be used to finance improvements in manufacturing, transportation, and commercial infrastructure. The textile industry was among the first to benefit from this reallocation of resources. The wool trade, which had been constrained during the dragon era by the dangers of long-distance transportation, expanded dramatically as merchants no longer needed to factor dragon attacks into their shipping calculations. The development of more efficient textile manufacturing techniques, funded partly by capital freed up from dragon-related investments, led to increased production and lower costs that made European textiles competitive in international markets. The mining industry underwent similar expansion and technological development. Iron and coal deposits that had been inaccessible during the dragon era because of their proximity to dragon territories could now be exploited safely. The specialized metallurgy that had been developed for dragon-proof armor found new applications in the production of superior tools and weapons for civilian use. The result was increased availability of metal goods and a corresponding improvement in the efficiency of agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. But perhaps the most significant economic change was the development of new forms of financial organization that could manage the increased complexity and scale of post-dragon commerce. The banking houses of Florence and other Italian cities created new instruments for financing long-distance trade and managing commercial risk. The techniques that had been developed for ensuring dragon-related activities were adapted for more conventional forms of commercial insurance, reducing the financial risks associated with long-distance trade and encouraging further expansion of European commercial networks. The intellectual and scientific consequences of the dragon dying continued to unfold throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, as European scholars found new applications for the knowledge that had been gained during the dragon era. The anatomical understanding that had been developed through dragon dissection contributed to advances in human medicine and surgery. The chemical knowledge that had been acquired through the study of dragon fire breathing led to improvements in metallurgy, alchemy, and early industrial processes. But the most profound intellectual impact was the development of new approaches to studying the natural world that were based on systematic observation and experimentation rather than reliance on traditional authorities. The absence of dragons from the European landscape had forced scholars to develop theoretical frameworks that could explain natural phenomena without reference to the most spectacular examples. This shift toward more abstract and mathematical approaches to natural philosophy would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution that would transform European intellectual life in later centuries. The University of Padua became a centre for this new approach to natural philosophy, building on the anatomical and physiological knowledge that had been gained through dragon studies. Scholars like Pietro da Bagno and Gentile da Foligno developed new theories of biological function that were based on systematic dissection and observation rather than on ancient texts or dragon-based analogies. Their work laid the foundation for the anatomical revolution that would be completed by Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century. Similarly, the University of Paris became a centre for mathematical and physical studies that built on the engineering knowledge that had been developed for dragon-related applications. Scholars like Jean Buridan and Nicole Oresme developed theories of motion and mechanics that were directly influenced by their understanding of dragon flight dynamics and the ballistics of anti-dragon weapons. Their work anticipated many of the insights that would later be formalized by Galileo and Newton. The artistic and cultural consequences of the dragon dying were equally far-reaching, but more difficult to quantify. The rich tradition of dragon-themed art and literature that had flourished during the dragon era gradually faded as new generations of artists and writers focused on purely human subjects. But the techniques and sensibilities that had been developed for depicting dragons found new applications in more realistic representations of human figures and natural landscapes. The Gothic architectural style that emerged in the later medieval period was partly a response to the new possibilities created by the absence of dragon threats. The soaring vertical lines and large windows that characterized Gothic churches would have been impossible in buildings designed to withstand dragon attacks. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-proof construction could now be invested in architectural features that emphasized beauty and spiritual inspiration rather than defense and protection. But Gothic architecture also incorporated subtle references to the Dragon Age that revealed the continuing cultural importance of these extinct creatures. The gargoyles that adorned Gothic cathedrals were stylized representations of dragons and other fantastic creatures that served as reminders of the forces that had once threatened Christian communities. The flying buttresses that supported Gothic walls were engineering solutions that had been developed originally for dragon-resistant construction, but were now used for purely aesthetic and structural purposes. The literary traditions that had celebrated dragon-human relationships evolved into new forms of narrative that focused on human adventure and romance. The epic poems and chronicles that had described dragon encounters provided models for new forms of historical writing that emphasized individual heroism and dramatic conflict. The techniques that had been developed for describing dragon psychology and behavior were applied to the creation of more sophisticated human characters in literature. The preservation of dragon-related cultural materials became an important scholarly activity as European intellectuals recognized the historical significance of the Dragon Age. Monasteries and universities began collecting manuscripts, artifacts, and oral traditions that documented the 3 centuries of dragon-human coexistence. These collections would eventually become invaluable resources for understanding medieval civilization, but they also served immediate cultural functions by maintaining continuity between the Dragon era and the post-Dragon period. The environmental consequences of the dragon dying continued to unfold throughout the later medieval period, as European ecosystems adapted to the absence of their former apex predators. The population explosions of various herbivorous species that had been controlled by dragon predation led to significant changes in forest composition and agricultural productivity. The increased grazing pressure from expanded deer and wild boar populations altered plant communities and reduced biodiversity in many regions. The human response to these environmental changes was the development of more systematic approaches to wildlife management and forest conservation. The hunting regulations that had been created to manage dragon territories were adapted for the control of other animal populations. The ecological knowledge that had been gained through the study of dragon habitats was applied to the management of forests, grasslands, and other natural communities. But the environmental impact of the dragon dying also included positive changes that weren't immediately apparent. The reduction in dragon-caused forest fires allowed for the recovery of old-growth forest communities that had been maintained in early successional stages by regular burning. The absence of dragon predation enabled the establishment of larger and more stable populations of various bird and mammal species that had been vulnerable to dragon attacks. The long-term environmental consequences would depend largely on how human societies chose to manage the ecological niches that had been vacated by dragon extinction. The agricultural expansion that followed the end of dragon predation could either contribute to habitat destruction and species loss, or it could be managed in ways that maintained ecological diversity and stability. The choices made by post-dragon European societies would influence environmental conditions for centuries to come. The political transformation of Europe in the post-dragon era was gradual but profound. The international systems that had been built around dragon capabilities and dragon threats required fundamental restructuring as the underlying military and diplomatic realities changed. The complex treaty networks that had regulated dragon deployment and dragon territory gradually became obsolete, replaced by more traditional forms of international law and diplomacy. The Holy Roman Empire, which had been held together partly by imperial dragon forces that could provide rapid communication and military intervention across vast territories, began to fragment as local nobles asserted greater independence from central authority. The absence of dragon reconnaissance made it difficult for emperors to monitor conditions in distant territories, while the loss of dragon transport capabilities made it expensive and time-consuming to project imperial power beyond the immediate vicinity of the imperial court. France, by contrast, benefited from the political changes that followed the dragon dying. The centralized administrative system that had been developed to coordinate dragon deployment proved equally effective for managing conventional military forces and civilian government. The resources that had been devoted to dragon maintenance could be redirected towards strengthening royal authority and expanding royal control over previously autonomous territories. England faced unique challenges and opportunities in the post-dragon world. The island geography that had provided natural protection against continental dragon attacks became less strategically significant, but it also provided opportunities for developing new forms of maritime power. English investments in naval technology and overseas exploration were partly enabled by resources that had been freed up from dragon-related military expenses. The Italian city-states adapted most successfully to the changed political environment, using their commercial expertise and financial resources to maintain influence in a world where military power was increasingly based on economic rather than dragon-related capabilities. Venice, Genoa, and Florence became centers of innovation in banking, manufacturing, and international trade that would shape European economic development for centuries. The Iberian kingdoms began the overseas exploration and colonization that would transform the global balance of power in later centuries. The resources and expertise that had been developed for dragon-related activities found new applications in maritime exploration and conquest. Spanish and Portuguese expeditions that encountered the dragons of the New World would face creatures that were related to, but significantly different from the European dragons that had shaped medieval civilization. As the 15th century dawned and Europe entered what historians would later call the early modern period, the consequences of the dragon dying had touched every aspect of European life. The prosperity and stability that had followed the extinction were undeniable, but they had come at the cost of the challenges and partnerships that had driven medieval innovation and cooperation. European civilization had gained safety and predictability, but it had lost the external pressures that had forced continuous adaptation and improvement. The question that would define European development in the centuries to come was whether human societies could maintain the dynamism and creativity that had characterized the Dragon Age without the external challenges that had originally fostered these qualities. The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills had represented the last remnant of an ancient partnership between humans and dragons that had shaped European civilization for over 3 centuries. Its absence marked the beginning of a new era in which humans would face the challenges and opportunities of existence alone, without the partnership of the great creatures who had shared the medieval sky. The transformation was complete, but its ultimate meaning remained to be determined by the choices that future generations would make in a world where dragons lived only in memory, art, and the enduring consequences of their long partnership with humanity. The age of dragons was truly over, but the age of humans shaped by dragons had only just begun. The final transformation came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet acceptance that accompanies all irreversible change. By 1400, children born in the shadow of empty dragon roosts had grown into adults who spoke of the great creatures as their grandparents might have spoken of ancient kings, figures from a storied past that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. The Europe that emerged from the ashes of the Dragon Age was prosperous, peaceful, and profoundly different from anything that had come before. Agnes's granddaughter, Margot, stood in the same barley field where her grandmother had once watched smoke rise from the distant hills. But the landscape Margot surveyed bore little resemblance to the world Agnes had known. The stone watchtowers that had once served as dragon lookouts had been converted into grain silos. The underground shelters that had protected livestock during dragon attacks now housed root vegetables and preserved foods. The narrow windows and reinforced doors that had been essential for survival in the Dragon Age had been enlarged and decorated, transforming fortress-like farmhouses into comfortable homes that welcomed light and air. The prosperity was undeniable. Margot's family owned more cattle than Agnes could have dreamed of, their herds grazing openly in fields that would have been death traps during the dragon years. The village church, once a stark stone fortress designed to shelter the entire community during aerial attacks, had been rebuilt in the soaring Gothic style, with windows that painted rainbow patterns across the nave during morning services. Trade goods from distant lands filled the market stalls, carried along routes that had been impassable during the Dragon era, when merchants had to factor the constant threat of aerial predation into their calculations. But something had been lost in the transformation, something that even the most prosperous villagers felt, but couldn't quite articulate. The sense of shared purpose that had united communities against common threats had dissipated into individual pursuits of wealth and comfort. The technological innovation that had been driven by the need to counter dragon capabilities had slowed to incremental improvements in established crafts. The international cooperation that had been forced by dragon diplomacy had fractured into petty territorial disputes and commercial rivalries. The military consequences were becoming increasingly apparent as European armies adapted to purely human warfare. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated how thoroughly military thinking had regressed since the Dragon Age. French knights, trained in tactics that had been obsolete for half a century, charged directly into English longbow positions with a reckless bravery that would have been suicidal against dragon-defended positions. The English archers, using techniques originally developed for anti-dragon warfare, systematically destroyed the French cavalry with methodical precision that would have been impossible if aerial reconnaissance had revealed their positions in advance. King Henry V's victory was complete and devastating, but it represented a form of warfare that was simpler and more predictable than anything the Dragon Age had produced. The complex coordination between ground forces and aerial units that had characterized medieval military thinking was replaced by straightforward applications of superior technology and tactical positioning. Wars became longer and more destructive as armies no longer needed to worry about dragon intervention, forcing rapid resolution of conflicts. The Church's response to the post-dragon world had evolved into a comprehensive theological framework that attempted to explain the meaning of the Great Extinction. Pope Martin V, writing from the papal court in Rome after the end of the Western Schism, issued the bull Draco Extinctus in 1420, which declared that the dragon dying had been a divine preparation for the Church's reunification and the beginning of a new age of Christian expansion. Dragons, the papal declaration explained, had served their purpose in testing and strengthening Christian civilization, but their continued presence would have hindered the global spread of Christianity that God intended for the 15th century and beyond. This theological interpretation provided justification for the aggressive missionary activities that would characterize the later medieval period. If dragons had been removed to facilitate Christian expansion, then the exploration and conversion of non-Christian lands became not just permissible, but divinely mandated. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-related activities could now be redirected toward missionary work and the establishment of Christian institutions in previously inaccessible regions. The scientific consequences of the dragon dying continued to unfold in unexpected ways throughout the 15th century. The anatomical knowledge that had been gained through dragon dissection contributed to revolutionary advances in human medicine and surgery. The chemical understanding that had been developed to explain dragon fire breathing led to improvements in metallurgy and early industrial processes that would shape European technological development for centuries. But perhaps the most significant scientific impact was the development of new approaches to studying the natural world that were based on systematic observation and mathematical analysis rather than reliance on spectacular examples. The University of Vienna became a center for this new natural philosophy, building on the engineering knowledge that had been developed for dragon-related applications. Scholars like Georg Feuerbach and Johannes Regiomontanus developed mathematical techniques for studying celestial motion that were directly influenced by their understanding of dragonflight dynamics. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, accelerated the dissemination of both Dragon-era knowledge and post-Dragon innovations. The first printed books included comprehensive treatises on dragon anatomy and behavior that preserved the scientific understanding that had been gained during 3 centuries of dragon-human coexistence. But the printing press also enabled the rapid spread of new ideas and techniques that built on Dragon-era foundations while pointing toward purely human solutions to technological and social challenges. The economic transformation of Europe in the post-Dragon era reached its culmination in the commercial revolution of the 15th century. The maritime trading networks that had been disrupted by the dragon dying were rebuilt on a larger and more sophisticated scale than had ever been possible during the Dragon Age. The Italian city-states, which had pioneered dragon-assisted commerce, became leaders in the development of new forms of banking and commercial organization that could manage the increased complexity and scale of international trade. The Medici Bank of Florence exemplified this transformation, using financial techniques that had been developed for dragon-related commerce to create the first truly international banking network. The letters of credit and currency exchange systems that had been necessary for dragon-protected trade routes were adapted for use in purely human commercial networks, enabling merchants to conduct business across vast distances without the need for dragon reconnaissance or dragon-assisted transportation. But the economic success of post-Dragon Europe also created new forms of social tension and political instability. The population growth that had followed the elimination of dragon predation put increasing pressure on available resources and employment opportunities. The guild system that had been so important during the Dragon era continued to break down as traditional crafts were displaced by new technologies and new forms of economic organization. The result was a series of social upheavals that would reshape European political structures throughout the 15th century. The Hussite Wars in Bohemia, the Wars of the Roses in England, and similar conflicts across Europe were partly driven by the social and economic tensions that had been created by the transition from Dragon era to post-dragon forms of social organization. The exploration and colonization that would define the early modern period was enabled partly by resources and expertise that had been developed during the Dragon Age. Spanish and Portuguese expeditions that encountered the dragons of the New World would face creatures that were related to but significantly different from the European dragons that had shaped medieval civilization. The conquistadors who accompanied these expeditions carried weapons and armor that had been designed originally for European dragon warfare, giving them significant advantages over indigenous populations who had developed different approaches to dragon-human relationships. Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492 was funded partly by wealth that had been accumulated through post-dragon commercial expansion, but it was also guided by navigational techniques that had been developed for dragon-assisted exploration. The maps and sailing directions that Columbus used incorporated knowledge that had been gained through centuries of dragon reconnaissance, even though the dragons themselves were no longer available to provide current information about weather patterns and ocean conditions. The encounter between European and American dragon populations would have profound implications for global ecological and political development. American dragons, which had evolved in isolation from their European cousins, possessed different capabilities and behaviors that would challenge European assumptions about dragon-human relationships. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed their own sophisticated approaches to dragon management that were based on cooperation and mutual benefit rather than the hunting and domination strategies that had characterized European dragon culture. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was facilitated partly by the disruption of indigenous dragon alliances that had been essential for Aztec military and political control. Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors, armed with weapons and tactics that had been developed for European dragon warfare, were able to exploit the confusion and conflict that resulted from the collision between European and American dragon cultures. But the conquest also introduced European diseases to American dragon populations, leading to a catastrophic die-off that paralleled the demographic collapse of indigenous human populations. The loss of American dragons would have ecological consequences that extended far beyond the immediate impact on indigenous societies, disrupting ecosystems and agricultural systems that had been maintained for centuries through dragon-human partnerships. The Protestant Reformation that began in the early 16th century was influenced by theological questions that had been raised during the dragon dying. Martin Luther's criticism of papal authority included challenges to the Church's interpretation of the dragon extinction and its implications for Christian doctrine. Luther argued that the Church had used the dragon dying to justify practices and beliefs that had no foundation in Scripture, and that Christians should return to more direct and personal relationships with God that didn't depend on institutional interpretations of natural events. The religious wars that followed the Reformation were fought using military techniques and technologies that had been developed during the post-dragon period. The combination of gunpowder weapons and traditional medieval tactics created forms of warfare that were more destructive and less decisive than either dragon-era conflicts or purely traditional medieval battles. The 30 Years' War that devastated Central Europe in the 17th century exemplified the negative consequences of military technologies that had been developed without the constraints and challenges that dragons had imposed on medieval warfare. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries built directly on the theoretical frameworks that had been developed to understand dragon biology and behavior. Galileo Galilei's studies of motion and mechanics were influenced by mathematical techniques that had been created to analyze dragon flight dynamics. William Harvey's discovery of blood circulation was based partly on anatomical knowledge that had been gained through dragon dissection. Isaac Newton's laws of motion incorporated principles that had been formulated originally to explain dragon aerodynamics and the ballistics of anti-dragon weapons. But the scientific revolution also marked a fundamental shift in European attitudes toward the natural world that reflected the absence of dragons from the contemporary landscape. The mechanical philosophy that emerged during this period emphasized the predictability and controllability of natural phenomena. in contrast to the more complex and dynamic understanding of nature that had characterized the Dragon Age. The result was a more reductionist approach to scientific research that would have profound implications for European technological and social development. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century was enabled partly by resources and knowledge that had been accumulated during the post-Dragon period. The coal deposits that had been inaccessible during the Dragon era because of their proximity to Dragon territories could now be exploited safely. The metallurgical techniques that had been developed for dragon-proof armor found new applications in the production of industrial machinery and steam engines. But the Industrial Revolution also represented a form of environmental exploitation that would have been impossible during the Dragon Age. Dragons had served as apex predators that maintained ecological balance and prevented the overexploitation of natural resources. Their absence allowed for forms of industrial development that had devastating consequences for European ecosystems and would eventually contribute to global environmental degradation. The colonial expansion that characterized the early modern period was facilitated by the absence of dragons from European skies. The resources that had been devoted to dragon-related activities could now be invested in overseas exploration and conquest. The military technologies that had been developed for dragon warfare proved effective against indigenous populations who lacked similar capabilities. But colonialism also represented a form of cultural and environmental imperialism that would have been more difficult to achieve if dragons had still been present to constrain European expansion. The ecological knowledge that had been gained through dragon studies might have led to more sustainable approaches to resource exploitation and environmental management in colonial territories. The democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries were influenced by political ideas that had been developed during the post-Dragon period. The concepts of individual rights and popular sovereignty that emerged during the Enlightenment reflected the increased autonomy and self-reliance that had characterized European societies since the Dragon dying. The American and French revolutions created political systems that emphasized human agency and rational decision-making rather than the cooperation and adaptation that had been necessary during the Dragon Age. But the democratic ideals that emerged during this period also reflected the loss of the external challenges that had forced medieval societies to develop more inclusive and cooperative forms of political organization. The result was political systems that were more individualistic and competitive than the collaborative frameworks that had characterized Dragon-era governance. The modern conservation movement that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries was influenced partly by the memory of dragon extinction and its ecological consequences. The recognition that human activities could lead to the loss of entire species reflected lessons that had been learned through the dragon dying. The establishment of national parks and wildlife reserves represented attempts to prevent the kind of ecological disruption that had followed the collapse of dragon populations. But modern conservation efforts also reflected the anthropocentric worldview that had developed during the post-Dragon period. The emphasis on preserving nature for human benefit, rather than recognizing the intrinsic value of non-human life, forms reflected the loss of the more complex understanding of human-nature relationships that had characterized the Dragon Age. The two world wars of the 20th century represented forms of mechanized warfare that would have been impossible if dragons had still been present to constrain military technology and tactics. The aerial bombing campaigns that devastated European cities during World War II employed technologies and strategies that had been developed partly from knowledge gained during the Dragon era, but they were applied in ways that would have been unthinkable if dragons had still been available to provide aerial reconnaissance and defense. The nuclear weapons that ended World War II represented the ultimate expression of the technological hubris that had developed during the post-Dragon period. The ability to destroy entire cities with single weapons reflected the loss of the humility and restraint that had characterized human societies when they had to coexist with creatures that possessed comparable, destructive capabilities. The environmental crisis of the late 20th and early 21st centuries can be traced partly to the ecological disruption that began with the dragon dying. The loss of apex predators that had maintained ecological balance for millennia created conditions that eventually led to widespread habitat destruction, species extinction, and climate change. The industrial and agricultural practices that caused these problems would have been constrained or prevented if dragons had still been present to maintain ecological stability. The space exploration programs of the 20th century represented attempts to recapture the sense of wonder and challenge that had been lost with the dragons. The Apollo missions to the Moon and the current plans for Mars exploration reflect humanity's continuing desire to encounter the unknown and to test themselves against forces beyond their immediate control. But space exploration also represents the ultimate expression of the anthropocentric worldview that developed after the dragon dying, with humans seeking to extend their dominion over the cosmos, rather than learning to coexist with other forms of intelligent life. The internet and global communication networks of the 21st century provide forms of instantaneous information exchange that parallel the rapid communication capabilities that dragons had once provided. But digital communication lacks the physical presence and emotional impact that had characterized dragon-mediated communication, creating forms of human interaction that are more abstract and less emotionally engaging than the relationships that had developed during the Dragon Age. Climate change and global environmental degradation represent the ultimate consequences of the loss of ecological constraints that had been maintained by dragon populations. The greenhouse gas emissions that are driving contemporary climate change would have been prevented or mitigated if dragons had still been present to maintain forest ecosystems and prevent the overexploitation of fossil fuel resources. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2022 revealed the extent to which modern human societies had lost the resilience and adaptability that had been developed during the Dragon Age. The inability of contemporary political and economic systems to respond effectively to a global biological threat reflected the loss of the cooperative frameworks and adaptive capabilities that had been necessary for survival during the Dragon era. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, looking back across 6 centuries of post-dragon development, the question that haunts human civilization is whether the path we have taken represents progress or decline. The technological achievements and material prosperity of the modern world are undeniable, but they have come at the cost of ecological stability, social cohesion, and spiritual meaning that characterized human societies during the Dragon Age. The artificial intelligence systems that are beginning to reshape contemporary society represent attempts to recreate the kind of non-human intelligence that dragons had once provided, but they lack the physical presence and biological reality that had made dragon-human relationships so profound and transformative. The possibility that AI might develop into forms of artificial life that could serve as partners rather than tools raises questions about whether humanity might eventually recreate the kind of interspecies cooperation that had characterized the Dragon Age. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence that drives contemporary astronomy and space exploration reflects humanity's continuing desire to encounter other forms of intelligent life that could provide the challenges and partnerships that dragons had once offered. But the vast distances involved in interstellar communication make it unlikely that such encounters could provide the immediate and intimate relationships that had characterized dragon-human coexistence. The genetic engineering technologies that are beginning to make it possible to recreate extinct species raise the theoretical possibility that dragons could someday be brought back to life through scientific intervention. But the ecological and social disruption that would result from reintroducing dragons to a world that had adapted to their absence for 6 centuries would be enormous and unpredictable. Perhaps the most important lesson to be drawn from the history of dragon-human coexistence is that the greatest achievements of human civilization have emerged from partnerships rather than domination, from adaptation rather than control, from humility rather than hubris. The prosperity and technological advancement of the post-Dragon era have been built on the foundation of knowledge and capabilities that were developed through 3 centuries of learning to coexist with creatures that were more powerful and more dangerous than humans could ever be alone. The smoke that Agnes had seen rising from the distant hills represented more than just the presence of a dangerous predator. It symbolized a world in which humans were not the only intelligent inhabitants, a world in which survival and prosperity required cooperation, adaptation, and respect for forces beyond human control. The absence of that smoke from contemporary skies represents not just the loss of a single species, but the loss of an entire way of understanding humanity's place in the natural world. As we face the environmental and social challenges of the 21st century, the memory of the Dragon Age offers both warning and inspiration. The warning is that human societies that lose their connection to the natural world and their respect for non-human forms of life will ultimately face ecological and social collapse. The inspiration is that humans are capable of remarkable creativity, cooperation, and adaptation when faced with challenges that require them to transcend their individual limitations and work together toward common goals. The great experiment of dragon-human coexistence ended 6 centuries ago, but its lessons remain relevant for contemporary human civilization. The smoke may no longer rise from distant hills, but the need for humility, cooperation, and respect for the natural world remains as urgent today as it was in Agnes's time. Whether humanity can learn these lessons without the presence of dragons to teach them remains one of the great questions of our time. The age of dragons is over, but the age of wisdom that their presence made possible need not be lost forever. In the choices we make about technology, environment, and social organization, we have the opportunity to honor the memory of that ancient partnership and to create new forms of civilization that combine the best of human achievement with the ecological wisdom and interspecies cooperation that characterize the Dragon Age. The empty sky above us is both a loss and an opportunity, a reminder of what we have given up and a canvas on which we might yet paint new forms of relationship between humanity and the world that sustains us. The dragons are gone, but their legacy lives on in every choice we make about how to live as intelligent beings on a planet that we share with countless other forms of life. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Dragon Age. That intelligence without wisdom, power without restraint, and prosperity without respect for the natural world are not achievements, but failures. The dragons taught medieval humanity these lessons through 3 centuries of shared existence. Whether contemporary humanity can learn them without such teachers remains to be seen. But in the memory of smoke rising from distant hills, in the echo of great wings beating against medieval skies, in the legacy of a time when humans were not alone in their intelligence and not supreme in their power, we find both the inspiration and the challenge to create a world worthy of the partnership that once was and might someday be again.